Chapter 2233? Published at 16th of October 2023 12 o'clock and 35 seconds p.m. Chapter 2233. Mistake: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2233. Mistake N-0 Velbin. This zone seems to be related to a so-called Silver Empire. It's facing destruction at the hand of outside forces. It seems that you were given my body because these forces include those from outside of this incomplete world. Lionel's gaze narrowed. When he realized what this meant, he almost smiled a bit bitterly as well. These so-called outside forces could only be those from the Cataclysm Zone. Compared to the Pluto race members, what were they worth? Had Lionel been able to keep Elryan's body, this zone wouldn't have been able to be any easier. It might even be the easiest zone he had ever completed. That said, there was no going back, and the matter also wasn't as simple as it seemed either. That's because without Elryan he wouldn't be able to understand this zone so easily. He had gained Elryan's body, not his memories, so he hadn't even known that a treasure as valuable as the hourglass had been on him. He couldn't remember Elryan holding any spatial treasures. Setting aside those feelings, this explanation didn't feel complete, and there were too many questions. Was he supposed to save the Silver Empire? But with how real this zone felt, wouldn't that change the timeline of the future? Or was the goal something else entirely? The Silver Empire is meant to be destroyed, but there is a tablet that you must recover before it can be. From my understanding, your future wife is currently the Emperor, while your mother is the current leader of a family that goes by the Luxniks. She is called Northern Star Order. Lionel frowned. Northern Star Order was one of the hegemonic titles of the Luxniks. Northern Star Order, Y Star Order, and Snow Star Order, these three represented great things. The problem was that according to Y Star Order, there had only ever been one Northern Star Order in the history of the Luxniks, the rest having all been fabrications by him, all 13 of them. Knowing this, the problem was obvious. That one Northern Star Order should be his grandmother. His grandmother was old, but she wasn't this old. This timeline at best should be around the time Y Star Order was born. At worst it was a generation before even Y Star Order's father was born. From Lionel's understanding, Northern Star Order should have been one of the very first Luxniks, so this didn't make any sense either. The only explanation was that Y Star Order didn't even understand his own family's history, or that old man had tried to con him again. Now that he thought about it, basically everything he knew about Luxnik's family history was told to him by that con man. But even worse than that, even if he had gone to the family record directly, Y Star Order had already manipulated them so that it would appear as though 13 Northern Star Orders had appeared in their history, effectively weakening his grandmother's influence on the family. Why wouldn't he have altered everything else? This was why Lionel hadn't even bothered to double-check. There was nothing to double-check against. Until now. Y Star Order was an ambitious man, and it wasn't easy to whittle that ambition down with just a few chains. He was a man who had experienced countless years and generations. He had even survived in the spiritual domain. His patience was far greater than Lionel knew. At the same time, though, the current Lionel wasn't the same Lionel of the past. Y Star Order couldn't think faster than any longer, and even without his father's protections, he could kill Y Star Order him. Leon's thought came to a halt. His father's death had taken quite a toll on him, and it had also exposed the fact that he was a far more caring man than Lionel knew, but that didn't change the fact that his old man was very particular about the kind of help he gave him. Even when he was in the Raypack's nest, his father hadn't done anything to help him, and there had been countless seventh-dimensional experts present. It could even be said that Velasco had made the situation worse. Because Velasco had appeared and killed all the scholars, the Raypack's elders were freed from their battles and were able to close in on Lionel and the others. Of course, in the end they did so to reward Lionel with the Black Rod, but that could have very well ended badly. If Velasco's glasses had told Lionel anything, it was that while his old man was soft at heart, he was hard in his actions. He wouldn't help Lionel with such a thing, unless he had to. Back then, Y Star Order had run circles around Lionel. Speed of thought or not, Lionel wasn't a fool, but he felt like a toddler. Could Y Star Order be stronger than he knew? And what was his purpose exactly? Why did he feel the need to hide the history of the Luxniks? And also, beyond that, his grandfather and his grandmother? Emperor Fox didn't seem like the type to randomly fall in love. As cruel as it sounded, Lionel had believed his grandmother to be a pawn in his grandfather's schemes for as long as he couldn't remember. But at the same time, his grandfather seemed to be restricted to staying within Earth's territory. How had he even met his grandmother? And if he could leave Earth for a price, then why did he insist on paying it to meet his grandmother? As Lionel was lost in thought, thinking of countless possibilities, he suddenly realized that Al Ryan had fallen into silence despite not having explained everything quite yet. He looked over toward the young boy to see that his expression was actually quite solemn. It wasn't a normal solemn, it was the kind that only appeared when one felt that they had made a mistake, a huge mistake. A mistake they couldn't reverse easily, a mistake they'd have to stay true to toward its ends. And that expression had come right after mentioning the Luxniks family. Chapter 2234. Published at 16th of October 2023 12 o'clock and 32 seconds p.m. Chapter 2234. The God Beasts. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2234. The God Beasts. Lionel didn't say anything, but he felt that he should have known after seeing that enormous void beast corpse in the skies, ridden by a race of beings he couldn't even fathom until this very moment. It was easy for Lionel to ignore the legends of the void beast because this world was so weak. Even a reasonable person could conclude that the Void Beast and Infinity Beasts were only legends in this incomplete world. However, what was becoming clearer and clearer to Lionel was that, if not for the appearance of the Pluto race, leading to the appearance of the Void race and their corpse battleship, this incomplete world wouldn't even know about these questions. This wasn't the only matter to consider either. The Luxniks family was a mere sixth-dimensional family in his eyes. Although they had gotten stronger after his grandmother's return to the Fox family, they were still subordinate to the Fox. Even though they only had the lowest level of the light side of the Northern Star lineage factor, why would he assume that they had the capability to have access to anything at this unconscionable level? Suddenly, Lionel's pupils constricted. N-0 Velbin, who had told him about the highest levels of the Northern Star lineage factor? Wasn't it Y Star Order? He wouldn't have even known otherwise. The more Lionel thought about it, the more he felt that something was off. Orion suddenly opened his mouth. Just when Lionel thought English would come out just like it had every time before, a language that sounded like the roar of dragons, with punctuation akin to claps of thunder, came out instead. Lionel felt his eardrums burst and begin to bleed, but he didn't cover them, even circulating his force so that he could heal them and hear more. It only lasted a brief few seconds, but Al Ryan turned to Lionel soon after. "I will go with you." Lionel's gaze narrowed. It seemed that his previous assumption was incorrect. If Al Ryan insisted on coming, then his thoughts that this would be an easy matter with him wouldn't be even remotely true. It seemed that there were no cheat codes to eighth-dimensional zones. "Are you going to tell me why? Or are you going to just do as you please?" "This isn't a simple matter to explain," Al Ryan said, somewhat exasperatedly. "You seem far too concerned for someone with that hourglass on you." "That isn't that hourglass, it's the hourglass." This distinction seemed very important to Pluto race boy, who was growing more agitated by the second. "Also, that item can't be used as freely as you think. You used it on me just fine. You're insignificant. The ties of karma and the wear of time and space are almost non-existent on you. The more prominent the target, the deeper the folds of reality, the more effort it would take. Judging by what I've understood, it would take one of my seniors coming for the hourglass to still be effective. And are they?" Lionel didn't react as though he cared about Pluto's slander at all. He was far more interested in the answer to this question. "No, we've already paid too high a price for this. It's up to me." "And me," Lionel added in a playful mood. The more agitated he saw this Pluto boy, the funnier he thought it was. Al Ryan looked at him as though he might try to strangle a chicken. He was really running out of rope to give. He knew that Lionel was doing it on purpose, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. Maybe god races were too prideful to use such tactics, but he had never met a person with such a foul mouth before. He still didn't know how Lionel seemed to have changed on a dime, but he didn't have time to think about it. "Just come," he eventually said, placing a large hand on Lionel's shoulder and taking out the hourglass. Lionel didn't resist, but he still raised an eyebrow. "You're obviously taking me because you need me, if not you would have already left. So are you going to ruin your chances by not telling me what's going on?" Al Ryan's jaw set as the two vanished into thin air. Lionel didn't ask again. He understood people quite well, even if they were god race beings. He only needed to say it once and then let enough time pass by that Al Ryan could pretend that it was his idea to explain. Sure enough, the explanation came. "You don't know why the god races exist. The management of the formation of worlds is something that's done out of necessity, not out of a will for power. There's only a limited amount of resources that existence can provide. Worlds need to die off, and you can't allow too many worlds to sprout up in their place. Before the god races, there were the god beasts. They were the embodiment of creation and destruction, and they were able to keep the balance. though they were also at constant war. This was the natural path of evolution, a path that existence allowed to occur. But for reasons unknown, existence also tends toward chaos, towards disorder, towards death. Due to this, the god-beast of creation has always been at a disadvantage. The greatest embodiment of this disadvantage are the regulators. They're born with every world, and their responsibility is only to make sure that a cap of power is never exceeded and the rules of practice are followed. However, the problem is that they work using the very same force that the god-beasts of destruction use. Anarchic force. The more regulators do their job, the more anarchic force a world is filled with, and the closer to death it approaches. Eventually, a balance will be tipped once the concentration of anarchic force reaches a certain stage. At that point, just as quickly, a world will die like a house of cards. If things continued like this, the god-beasts of destruction would eventually win, but the process would be slow, too slow for them. The god-beasts of destruction were not known for their patience. So, they created henchmen that shared a small portion of their bloodlines to spread chaos to the worlds. Chapter 2235. Published at 16th of October 2023 12 o'clock and 12 seconds p.m. Chapter 2235. The Northern Star. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2235. The Northern Star. Lionel's pupils constricted. He could tell what Elryan was getting at immediately. He had only reacted like that after he mentioned the Luxnix family, and it was the Luxnix family that had access to the Northern Star lineage factor, the very lineage factor that ended in the Void Beast and the Infinity Beast, or in other words, the god-beast of destruction and the god-beast of creation. The so-called henchmen of the Void Beasts had to be those of the dark side of the Northern Star lineage factor. That was the only conclusion. And sure enough, the god-beasts of destruction realized a problem, though. Their bloodlines were far too powerful. Even the current god races couldn't take them without dying agonizing, slow deaths. So they took a different approach, splitting the aspects of their bloodlines into 5 pieces and building them up like stepping ladders. They created a legion of beasts: the Shadow Tail, the Dusky Steel Bat, the Aurora Black Panda, the Crimson Clawed Ape and the Death Pulse Deer. Each one took up a position in the armies of the god-beasts of destruction, and they were powerful. They were enormous beasts with wings that could crush the planets of this incomplete world of yours and claws that could sever stars into countless pieces. In the beginning, the god-beasts of destruction felt that this would be enough. Their envoys were more powerful than they thought they'd be, and far more helpful as well, so it no longer seemed necessary to pass down their bloodline. They were haughty creatures to begin with, impatient, disdainful, and arrogant. If they didn't have to share their bloodlines, they wouldn't. But the god-beasts of creation didn't roll over. Seeing the state of things and how the god-beasts of destruction were acting, they realized that they could fight back in the same way, and it might even give them a chance at reversing the tide. So, they created their own beast envoys. The Snowy Star Owl, the White Stone Elephant, the Starry-Tailed Fox, the Twinkling Light Bear, the Golden Tiger. The god-beasts of destruction were on their back foot. Their beast envoys were incredibly powerful, but they couldn't compare to the beast envoys of the god-beasts of creation. After all, they were beasts of destruction and chaos. How could they compare to god-beasts of creation in creating? Having given the god-beasts of creation such an idea, the god-beasts of destruction regretted their action, but it was already far too late to reverse things. At the same time, the god-beasts of creation felt that they could seal things, to put a final nail in the coffin, to finally end things, so they did what the god-beasts of destruction couldn't and passed down their bloodline. N-O-V-E-L-B-I-N. At first they looked through the various god races or what they had once been, and realized that they couldn't do what needed to be done, and neither could the others, but interestingly enough, there was one race that was able to do so. And an unexpected race. The human race. Lionel fell into silence. He knew that there was much more to this story and that Elryan was far from finished, but his mind couldn't help but spin at 1,000 miles an hour. It was suffocating the number of questions he had. The human race is born with a birth defect, but it's also that defect that allowed them to take on the power of the god-beasts of creation. Their souls are born fused to their bodies, but this also makes it so that there's only one variable to consider from start to finish. As you change their bodies, you can easily change their souls at the same time given that you have enough power. Like this, one of the weakest races of existence gained maybe the greatest power, and existence gained itself prosperity. A golden age the likes of which had never been seen before and would likely never be seen again. Unfortunately, this didn't last. Elryan fell into silence. looking toward Lionel with a darker expression than usual. Luckily, his rationality seemed to win over and he managed to calm himself. As for what his rationale was telling him, Lionel could guess by the way the story was going. It seemed that the palpable disdain of the human race didn't just come from their weakness. He had vaguely felt that Shanray's vitriol whenever she spat out the word human was much deeper than it seemed to be on the surface, but even when he realized this he just chuckled. What was this? A cliché line about how corruptible humans were and how much better other races were in comparison? What a joke. How about they be granted infinite power first and see how they dealt with it? From what he could see, these god races weren't much better. An entity that attacked his junior out of rage? What high horse did they have to sit on, exactly? As I said, existence tends towards chaos, it's just a simple rule of law. Absolute chaos must be formed first before everything can return to step one. The more energy existence expends, the closer toward death it grows. Existence is the only immortal in all of reality. The pressure of the Golden Age wasn't missed by existence, but it did nothing, it could do nothing. Existence isn't an entity, it's simply an arbitrator of rules, and the god-beasts of creation didn't break any rules, they simply followed their instinct. In fact, they did exactly as they were meant to and created. But, as existence is the only immortal, it is also the only infallible being in all of reality as well. They went overboard, spreading too much wealth and prosperity. Existence was quickly becoming overwhelmed and worlds began to collapse. Death and destruction spread ironically without even the god-beasts of destruction doing a single thing. And that was when it appeared. The Northern Star. Chapter 2236. Published at 16th of October 2023 12 o'clock and 1 second p.m. Chapter 2236. Unchallenged. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2236. Unchallenged. L. Ryan looked up. His expression solemn, a touch of sadness and forlornness on his expression. It wasn't the kind of face that a child should make, but Lionel felt a hint of subtlety within it, the kind that told him that this expression wasn't perfectly his, but rather one that had been passed down. It was an interesting feeling. But he felt that if the future could impact the past, then it wasn't too unacceptable. That said, he felt it was more complicated than that. End/OV/E/L-B 1. Na race like the Pluto had abilities he couldn't fathom. Even turning back time across existence wasn't outside their purview. Maybe they had a method of passing down important thoughts and feelings to their highest priority descendants. The Northern Star is quite beautiful, isn't it? Orion suddenly said. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. Why did he suddenly feel that the Northern Star Orion was mentioning was the very same Northern Star he was so familiar with? The Northern Star was the hope of sailors and adventurers of Earth. No matter how lost you were, so long as you pinpointed that star in the skies, you could find your way home. It was the single constant even when death had you by the ankles. However, these were mostly just folktales. The Northern Star couldn't even be seen on half of Earth, so most of the fanciful tales around it were just overblown and exaggerated. But that didn't change the fact that even the smallest child of Earth knew of the Northern Star and the kind of hope it represented. Elryan couldn't be talking about the same star. Right? He was. It can be seen from everywhere, it's the constant in all of our lives. No matter where you are, it can orient your direction. But what most people probably aren't aware of is the fact that the meaning of the Northern Star is far more real and simultaneously philosophical than just that alone. The Northern Star is the central point of all of existence, but it isn't at the center of all things, it's rather at the end of all things. It's the point that we all go toward, it's the final flash of light, the penultimate representation of life before only death is left. In the past, it didn't have a prominent name because it was too far away. But the closer we get to the death of existence, the more prominent it is in the skies, the brighter it becomes, the more hope it seems to spread. Elryan fell into silence once again, trying to gather himself. His solemnness retreated and his deadpan expression took hold as he looked forward. The calmness he feigned only seemed to make the previous agitation all the worse in comparison. The source of all star force comes from the Northern Stars, and it's also the greatest center of death. Not many understand what star force is or what it represents, but I can tell you there is really no point in trying to in the first place. Just think of it as the fabric of reality, it's what gives existence substance, but more importantly than that, it brings balance, or rather, a relative balance. The more success the god-beasts of creation had, the closer the star became, the stronger by comparison the god-beasts of destruction became. Star force fueled them and they began to make a comeback, fiercer and stronger than before. This time the god beasts of destruction succeeded. They passed down their bloodlines to the human race, and suddenly one of the weakest races of existence became the center of a blood war that ravaged reality. The details of this war are murky, but ultimately there was no winner. Although the god beasts of destruction had become stronger, the head start of the god beasts of creation was substantial. At the same time, it wasn't yet time for existence to collapse, so the northern star shifted the balance once again when the time came, whittling away the strong advantage the god beasts of destruction had, but not before they had sunk their claws into every aspect of existence. The gods' beasts practically went extinct after that war, but existence continued toward destruction, getting closer and closer. Every day the northern star grows larger, and as it does, the void beasts of destruction grow as well, and soon they'll likely make a comeback of their own. Unfortunately, the time of the infinity beasts has passed. There isn't enough momentum of creation left. Elryan fell into silence. Lionel didn't say anything. He felt that he was beginning to understand how important these incomplete worlds were now. They might very well be among the last worlds that existence could create before everything collapsed. In fact, the fact there were so many incomplete worlds might be a sign in and of itself. If not for the slow weakening of existence and the approach of the northern star, there might have been far more complete worlds in this batch than what had actually occurred. Even so, Lionel had more questions than answers right now. Elryan still hadn't explained how these two separate lineage factors had suddenly become linked. Was it because of the northern star? In that case, Lionel's eyes narrowed. Could the northern star be the constellation of the lineage factors, forcefully linking them and causing the strength of one to be dependent on the weakness of the other? In that case, what happens to Lionel when the two are fused like this? Also, how is it even possible for Lionel to fuse them? It can't be that he's the first if the people of the Cataclysm Zone had both tablets as well, right? That doesn't make sense. More importantly than that, how are even the likes of the Pluto allowing such tablets to circulate at all? Why haven't they gathered them all up yet? More dark side henchmen would only speed up the descent toward chaos, while more light side henchmen would only exacerbate the problem. No? Both should be eradicated? And there was something else that Elryan had conveniently not mentioned. If even the human race could be disdained for a now faint connection, then how were the void race allowed to prance around unchallenged? What was their relation to all of this? Chapter 2237, published at 16th of October 2023, 11:59 and 51 seconds AM. Chapter 2237. Timeless event. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2237. Timeless event. Lionel frowned. There was something obvious that he was missing, and that was Elryan's reaction. Since he had reacted so violently and even insisted on joining himself, then it likely meant that he would do something about this and they weren't ignoring the problem. But wasn't this too nonchalant? If this was such a big matter, why were the Pluto sending a junior? Something was off here. He was missing large bits of information. If this matter is so important, why are they sending you? Lionel asked. Elryan looked slightly offended when he heard this, but he quickly settled down. You don't understand. So politics, Lionel answered simply, and Elryan seemed to be quite embarrassed because Lionel's answer was spot on, so much so that he didn't even want to continue explaining. But in the end his better judgment won out. Novi, LB1N, there are many factions among the god race, each one with different thoughts on how to deal with this situation. Most believe that pacifism is the best choice. The last time the scales were tipped, the timeline toward destruction was accelerated. Lionel nodded. The good guys won, and instead of that being a win, it ended up being a loss. And obviously they couldn't side with the bad guys, or else they'd just be shooting themselves in the foot. Indeed, it did sound best to just sit back and ignore everything, hoping that the natural path of balance would extend their lives for the longest. But this also seemed quite defeatist, no? The mighty god races were just waiting for their deaths? It was almost amusing. Then again, maybe they were just like humans. Elryan had said that the only immortal in all of reality was existence itself. That meant that even these gods had finite lifespans. Maybe they felt that they would long be dead by the time the northern star was the only star in the sky. It would be someone else's problem by then. They just wanted to hold on to the power they had for now. As expected, Elryan's expression was quite dark when he said this. Clearly he wasn't resigned to this sort of fate either. Lionel found it to be a bit cute. Then he felt that maybe he was being a bit too nonchalant about this. He didn't know why, but he couldn't quite drum up the momentum to give a damn. Elryan took a breath, steadying himself. He really was all over the place today. Just what was happening to him? He was better than this. Their thoughts have some logic to it. The humans that could reach the highest realms of the Northern Star lineage factor all died in the war. Those that are left can at most reach the level of the highest envoys, but those bloodlines within humans are far weaker than they would be in the real deal. This is also true for the god-beast of creation and destruction as well, but even a fraction of their power was enough to place humans on the same level as us god races. Well, at least near the middle levels of us god races. Lionel thought about the visions of those massive beasts he had seen whenever he progressed his lineage factor, and then he thought about the power he had in comparison to that, and he couldn't help but nod to himself. The snowy star owl he had seen when he awakened his lineage factor initially had been able to cross an entire galaxy with a single flap of its wings. The dusky steel bat could envelop a planet with its wings. But in Lionel's eyes, they were mere 6th-dimensional and 7th-dimensional lineage factors. They weren't even worth much in this incomplete world, let alone in the outside world. So staying hands-off made sense. Their existences were inconsequential while they risked the end of everything if they interfered with the wrong matter. Seeing Lionel be so amused with himself, Ryan gave him a glance. There is also a minority faction who think the best thing to do to remain neutral is to eradicate all humans from the face of existence. Ryan unfortunately didn't get the response he wanted out of this. Let me guess, the Void Race? Lionel asked with a laugh. Ryan's gaze flickered. Oh. Lionel responded, seemingly somewhat surprised but not really. He felt that a Void Race wanting to commit mass genocide was too on the nose. They're even more extreme. They believe that the best way to extend the life of existence is to erase most of the worlds that remain. If there's a second faction after those that want to remain perfectly neutral, it's them. That's because the Void Race had evolved into a race that seemed to have an ability that might be able to reset existence. Lionel raised an eyebrow. You saw it? They can destroy worlds and absorb them into their being. Just this action alone maintains the balance exactly as is. Every time a world is about to be destroyed, one of their ancestors absorbs it instead. That action hides the destruction from the Northern Star and everything remains the same. The Northern Star hasn't moved any closer in the last at least several generations. Lionel chuckled. Wasn't there an obvious weakness to this solution? What happened when one of their ancestors died? The worlds they had absorbed would surely be noticed by the Northern Star then. At that point it would just be delaying the inevitable. You seem to have thought of the problem as well, but they feel that they can find a solution. It's just that their ancestors haven't grown powerful enough yet to break through that final barrier, to exceed the limits of the 9th dimension. They want to sacrifice as many worlds as they need to toward that end. Once again, Ryan didn't receive the response he wanted. So they want to be the universe's janitor. How noble of them. Ryan was truly speechless this time. He really didn't know how to deal with this man. You still haven't told me though. Lionel changed the subject. What's got you so agitated this time? There's a timeless event that's about to begin. Timeless event? It's an event that will occur no matter what changes in the past or the future. Chapter 2238. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 49 seconds AM. Chapter 2238. Why bother? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2238. Why bother? A timeless event, huh? Lionel said softly. Timeless events usually happen when the Northern Star reached a new stage. Existence won't allow anyone to reverse such a thing, or more accurately, it's impossible to reverse. The one thing that can't be fought against is existence itself. And this time, Ryan came to a stop. The stream of stars and galaxies that had been blowing by them came to a stop, and they stood above a familiar huddle of 3 planets, but they were much different than what Lionel remembered. The 3-pillar sector was the home of the Luxnix family and 2 others, namely the Viola and Montex. The other 2 seemed to be irrelevant to the matter at hand, but Lionel still kept their names in the back of his mind because he felt that none of this was as it seemed. If all of this was really a scheme of Y Star Order, then in all likelihood, everything had been done for a very specific purpose. Of course, Y Star Order was also a master at sleight of hand and could very easily make him focus on something that he shouldn't be focused on at all, but his mind now was on a completely different level than it usually was. He wouldn't be tricked so easily. In the past, the 3 planets were in a perfect sort of harmony. One golden with swirling white clouds, another violet with dark hues of black, and the final with countless mountainous regions that could even be seen from the depths of space. Today this territory was that of the Silver Empire, and the planets didn't look like what he remembered at all. This force, how can it be here? Elryan's expression changed once more. I've made a mistake, I shouldn't have come so casually. This really isn't something that I should interfere in. Elryan's expression settled down, and his words came out in a calm and calculated analysis. He had clearly seen something that he didn't like in the slightest and wanted to back out as soon as he could. Lionel didn't say anything. He felt that he understood what Elryan was trying to get at, or more accurately, he seemed to have instantly understood what force he was talking about. A spark went off through his dreamscape and it all pointed toward a single person. Richard of the Viola family and his violet force. And if that was the case, it explained everything he was seeing below. End/OV/E/L-B1. It was like he had been transported back to the 19th century Earth. There were billowing columns of black fumes, projected out from factories that looked as though they had been pulled out straight from a black and white movie. Workers moved around like slaves, transporting things in and out of these large factories that took up all 3 planets. They seemed to cover every inch except for a single patch on the former planet Luxnix, or rather soon to be. This patch was vibrant with greenery and a river of violet. This violet, though, he felt something far different from it. Even when Richard used that force he didn't feel moved. But now he felt a great amount of danger. If he had been there when Richard lamented his lineage factor, maybe he would have understood somewhat. Richard had said that it felt like someone had played a sick joke on his family, giving them a power that they couldn't make proper use of at all. It was like a tumor within their soul, leeching away their lives with every passing moment. It was a truly devastating chain to be burdened with. Lionel's smile faded, and the coldness of his gaze returned. He still didn't understand what was going on, but there was one person who could give him an answer. He looked within the segmented cube. He probably should have expected it. The script practically wrote itself. Wise Star Order was nowhere to be found. In fact, if Lionel thought back, he had been nowhere to be seen ever since his father died. He just hadn't bothered to take note of it because he didn't care. And why would he need to appear at all? If this was a timeless event, then that meant that he didn't need to put his hand on the scale anymore. He had already done his job and victory was his. You shouldn't have come at all if you thought it was a timeless event, Lionel said casually. Elryan froze, but he didn't know how to respond to that. Indeed, he was far too impulsive. What could he do to change a timeless event? No, he said, somewhat forced. Timeless events are variable in that no one knows exactly what aspect of them definitely has to happen and what parts can be tweaked. A bomb might have to explode and kill many people, but the word many might be variable. It could be that only a select combination of people have to die, while the rest can be saved. You made resurrecting people sound like it was impossible, but now you want to save people who should die? Lionel asked blandly. He didn't seem to be accusing Elryan because he had never taken his words seriously in the first place. You are a truly aggravating individual. Thank you, Lionel said. Now can you tell me what this supposed timeless event is? Soon, many citizens of this Silver Empire will be gathered up and slaughtered for their parts. They'll be brought to this factory and will be refined, and it will be allowed because they are demons. Sounds simple enough to stop, just destroy the factories. What about timeless event, do you not understand? Elryan's voice nearly came out in that dragon's roar once again. If we destroy these factories, they'll come up with another method, a different approach, a different path that leads to the same thing. Lionel smiled. Then tell me again. Why did you bother coming? Elryan saw red and suddenly punched out at Lionel, his fist carrying the weight of worlds. He had completely forgotten to hold back. Chapter 2239. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 48 seconds AM. Chapter 2239. Dream Step. Dream Shock. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2239. Dream Step. Dream Shock. Lionel's expression was already cold, but it was even more calculating than that. He had already felt the twitch of the start of Elryan's action before he even moved with intention. Inwardly, he still found it amusing, but there was nothing amusing about the power of the fist approaching him right this moment. There was no facing it, the only option was to dodge. And luckily he was ready to do so. His steps moved at the same moment Elryan did, his head tilting to the side, and his body narrowing from Elryan's perspective. For a long while, Lionel had thought about maybe learning a dedicated technique for his movement, thinking that it might help boost himself to an all-new level. But every time he entered a situation like this one, he realized why he never had. Calculating which step to take was far better than any movement technique he could learn from someone else. Let's call it Dream Step. His hair fluttered as the roaring beast that was L. Ryan's strike flashed by his cheek, leaving a searing heat on their surface. But when had he ever feared heat? Boom. Even in the depths of space, there seemed to be the boom of wind and the collapse of the sound barrier, but Lionel realized that it was far more devastating than that. It was more like reality itself. The fabric of space, the folds of reality, had collapsed. It was truly ridiculous that a 14-year-old had such power. What would he be like after finishing puberty? Lionel reached forward with 2 fingers and jabbed them into the Pluto youth's rib cage. The latter was so large compared to him that his fingers would easily fit through the gaps. But slipping through was one matter, actually piercing through this tough, grayish-blue skin was a different matter entirely. However, Lionel didn't plan on piercing L. Ryan's skin. He had been in the latter's body already. He knew that it was very similar to that of humans aside from some small difference. He had not 1 stomach but 4 of them. He had not 1 heart but 2 of them. His muscle fibers made what Lionel was proud of seem like more of a joke than anything else. But the liver was still the liver. Spear force raged to life on the tips of his fingers, growing pointed and flashing with a bright gold. Bang! Lionel's 2 fingers pierced into the right side of L. Ryan's body, his timing perfect. L. Ryan was slow to react, having regretted his punch the moment he threw it out. That was when he felt a sudden jarring pain. At first he hadn't felt that it was anything. He only wanted to let Lionel hit him out of apology, or that was what he told himself. He didn't know if he could dodge even if he had tried his very best. But right then his nerves seemed to have been fried and his entire body shut down. He shuddered and fell to a knee. He would have even fallen to the planets below if not for Lionel grabbing onto his shoulder with a palm, squeezing down. Even with him kneeling like this, he was still much taller than Lionel, and the latter had to reach up to grip him. Even so, he suddenly felt very small and somewhat embarrassed. He looked down like a child that had done something wrong, and for the first time, Lionel felt that this behemoth actually looked like he was 14 years old. N-0 vel B1 and Lionel actually felt somewhat bad for a moment. In truth, he had cheated as well. In the last moment he realized that his strength wouldn't be enough to pierce L. Ryan's defenses, so he had added something unexpected to his spear force. Dream Force. His spear domain lineage factor was perfectly designed to accept the power of other forces. That was maybe its foundational strength. So, it had happened seamlessly. He used his Dream Force to amplify the feedback L. Ryan felt from his strike, amplifying a dull quake into a flood. He had never been able to emit his Dream Force in the past, but now that he had his emulation spatial force innate note, not to mention his domains, it was no longer that difficult for him. He had gotten much more used to the feeling after assimilating Lionel as well, though that power had already faded. L. Ryan's body had shut down, but it was just a trick of the mind, one that he would have probably shrugged off quite easily if he wasn't a child who felt that he was in the wrong. Lionel let L. Ryan rise after the latter had recovered. 2 new abilities in just a short few seconds, not bad. I should spend more time on my ability index. Let's call this one Dream Shock. Better? Lionel asked. L. Ryan didn't respond. He felt bad, but that didn't mean he had stopped thinking that Lionel was a bit of an asshole. That said, he realized that this man was doing this on purpose, and getting frustrated was only playing into his hands. This time he would truly take his time to calm down. He was a Pluto, he couldn't keep allowing this to happen. Lionel smiled but he didn't say anything. An agitated Pluto wasn't a useful Pluto. How would he make use of him if he was a loose cannon? Things were much better like this. At that moment, a starship suddenly flashed from the distance, coming out from a spatial tunnel. The markers of shield cross stars rose to the skies, and those familiar cool uniforms were lined across the bow of the ship. Lionel's senses pierced by them and into the ship, finding several barriers. But with a release of his dream domain, seeing through those barriers was as easy as breathing. He froze. Initially he didn't care very much. There were just a large number of prisoners likely being taken to those factories down below. However, deep within he saw a man chained up, wearing broken silver armor that was all too familiar with. Then L. Ryan's words flashed in his mind. Lionel vanished before L. Ryan could react. Chapter 2240? Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 2240. Crushed slowly. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2240. Crushed slowly. Lionel didn't spare the time to think about what relation shield cross stars might have to this matter. Nor did he think about how this might be tied to the timeless event. His body moved on its own and his speed was blazing. Why should he be surprised? It was a deduction he felt was obvious, even though he had never thought about it too clearly, especially after he had decided to crush the human domain. After he had thwarted the plan of God and the bishop, then continued to do so once again in the Camelot zone, he had offended a mysterious organization. Then not long afterward Shield Cross Stars targeted him, leading him to become a fugitive. And oh, Elbein, could there even be such a coincidence in this world? He could feel his mage core rip force from the surroundings, forcing the spatial force to bow in obedience as he crossed into the flying space of the starship instantly. Those of Shield Cross Stars didn't expect to suddenly be attacked like this. Their flags were flying high, and who of the human domain didn't know of their standing? Such a standing had only solidified further after they had crushed the Silver Empire beneath their boots. Who still dared to attack them? Spatial Force User. Deploy the barriers. Cross Elder Avon had yet to be born yet, maybe even his grandfather hadn't even been born yet. This current mission was being led by a certain Cross Elder Crystal, a woman built like a behemoth, standing with hulking shoulders and an even fiercer face. The way the patented metallic skirt of Shield Cross Stars swayed between her legs beneath the forceful nature of her force made it seem as though it was made of silk rather than metal. She spotted Lionel with a sharp gaze. Although she could tell that Lionel was only in the 7th dimension, she felt that something was off about this matter. While it was possible that he was a straggling member of the Silver Empire taking a long shot at revenge, having lost his head to fury, anyone who knew Cross Elder Crystal knew that she did everything by the book. Even though she could crush a 7th-dimensional expert with a single look, she still forced them to deploy the shield, solidifying the spatial force in the region and ripping away what she thought was Lionel's greatest advantage. But soon enough she realized that her caution actually wasn't enough. At that moment the pull of Lionel's mage core surged and shredded the barriers apart. The restrictions that had once been able to hold him in place were torn apart, fueling his spatial force further and allowing him to jump forward even faster. Cross Elder Crystal's eyes narrowed. The defensive barrier was already up, so one could say that by deploying a spatial lock she was doing far more than was necessary. This wasn't a Tier 2 starship like the ones in Lionel's possession. This was a tried and true Tier 1 starship. Its power wasn't just a small bit greater, and its size was at least that of 10 planets. Ready the cannons. Another crew might have questioned why their commander was taking things so seriously, but this group had long since learned that questioning Crystal was a quick path to death. They aimed the cannons that could kill even overlords with a single stroke toward the swiftly approaching 7th-dimensional expert, already ready to fire. Fire. Lionel vanished. He appeared before the defensive barrier, his hand stretching out. Under the astonished gazes of the crew and the almighty Cross Elder, the barrier crumbled beneath Lionel's palm as though it was nothing more than ash in the wind. Lionel's current craftsmanship was on a level even life-grade crafters couldn't fathom. If he still allowed this sort of barrier to stop him, creating as the peak technology of a race not even capable of being at the peak of an incomplete world, what breakthroughs he had made would only be worthless. With a step, Lionel crossed the shattered motes of light, a sort of deathly beauty surrounding him as his spear appeared in his hands and his third-tier armor surrounded him. Morales. Cross Elder Crystal barked. State your name. How dare the Morales interfere in the matters of Shield Cross Stars? Lionel's abilities weren't exactly like she remembered the Morales to be, and she had also never seen a Morales without dark hair and eyes, but it was also hard to deny what she was seeing before her. She instantly decided to probe to see if she was correct about her assumption, but all she got in return was a blade. No, it wasn't a blade. It was a raging tornado of swirling spear force. Cross Elder Crystal went pale. When had the Morales produced a spearman with this level of skill? She didn't even realize that she had already forgotten that Lionel was only in the 7th dimension. The spear force didn't even touch her, but the instant it vanished her subordinates fell to the deck one after another, and Lionel had already crossed by her, vanishing into the ship. She was violently shaken awake. Alert! Lionel, who had already entered the ship, found that all the high lights were turned off, replaced by flashing, deep rouge warning lights, supplemented by a blaring sound that made the ears want to scream. To his back he sensed an oppressive aura pressing down on him. His spatial force felt more useless in this place than anywhere else. The best barrier was dense force of all kinds, it made it unstable to teleport anywhere, and unfortunately the walls of this starship were flooded with force pouring in from the core. Lionel could only run the normal way and obviously he couldn't outpace an ancestor. But he could outsmart one. His gaze flickered with a dense cold light as his stance shifted, dodging out of the way of a strike coming from his back and cutting a corner. He understood this ship like the back of his hand, and he had a feeling that even this Cross Elder wasn't intimately familiar with this maze-like ship. At the same time, this ancestor couldn't attack with her full force for fear of injuring her companions. He would crush her slowly. Chapter 2241. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 2241. Not enough. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2241. Not enough. Lionel moved like lightning, his agility hitting a completely different level. Every time he came across a Shield Cross Star member, he slaughtered them without mercy. And OV/L/B/I. And although he didn't think about it much, it was almost amusing how difficult it used to be for him to kill. But he felt like he was a boulder one had rolled up from the bottom of a steep mountain. He reached the other side now and was tumbling with such speed that it was hard to tell what would happen when he got down to the bottom. Would he smoothly roll out and crush everything in his path? Or would he smash himself into countless little pieces? Lionel turned another corner, but this time his fist flashed, coated with a beautiful gold-black armor. Death force erupted from it, a raging steam. It didn't seem to want to form into something solid, preferring to be an amorphous fog akin to dark force, but Lionel's mage core compressed it down, forcing it into a gauntlet that smashed through. A rush of pressure came gushing out. Screams filled the room as a dense heat and a leak of the fusion core spilled boiling energy into the region. Lionel seemed entirely unaffected. Could this fusion core's energy be hotter than the innate nodes that burned in his kidneys? Hot star force? Was there a hotter star force than Scarlet Star Force? Without even turning back, the energy was pulled under his control, forming a curtain that Crystal braced herself to storm through. Her speed picked up, her hair singed and her fury bellowing as loudly as the hissing steam. She couldn't understand how a mere Tier 1 could blast a hole through the walls of this ship at such a critical point. How could channels carrying such hot fusion core energy not be heavily reinforced? But Lionel had burst through them so easily that she hadn't even been able to catch up after he slowed. Watching her subordinates die one after another, her blood threatened to boil over. The frustration of not being able to unleash her full strength for fear that she might cause more damage felt like she had been wrapped in plastic, her nose and mouth and all. She couldn't even run with her full force because her legs would blast through the floors, destroying whatever was below. The other Cross Elders had told her many times that she had to learn to be more delicate, but she had never expected that it would come back to bite her like this. She roared out in frustration as she turned a corner. As though a dragon, a line of force shot out from her lips, aiming for Lionel's back. Earth force? Lionel sneered inwardly. Trying to use Earth force as though it was fire force is amusing enough. Trying to use it against me though, when you haven't stepped into the impetus stage despite being an ancestor, is even more amusing. The breath of force split around Lionel's body, being ripped from the Cross Elder's control. Lionel turned back as he continued to glide forward, his steps just as light. He raised his fists, the Cross Elder's 8th dimension-backed force pulling into gauntlets on his fist. He could feel their rage, shaking and quaking as he struggled to control them. In the end, an ancestor's full strength was still beyond him. But this wasn't her full strength. He inhaled a breath and his spear force surged before he punched out twice. He turned around and continued to rush forward, not even looking back. Crystal's expression changed once again, feeling a slight sense of danger. In the back of her mind, another question rose. Just how had Lionel used spear force with a punch? She had seen other masters use 2 fingers before, but that was still with the intention to treat their arm as a spear. But Lionel clearly hadn't had that intention. He had been thinking about punching all the while. Doing that should have caused his spear force to scatter. This boy is dangerous. Bang. Cross Elder Crystal stumbled back a strong step. The ground beneath her crumpled slightly as though it was aluminum foil. Her palms stretched out as she caught her own attack. She thought that she could deal with it easily as it was her own force added with a mere 7th dimensional expert's force. But the spike of pain was immediate. She retrieved her palms after the force had vanished, looking down to see a spiral of blood trickling down her hands. She was astonished. A 7th dimensional brat had injured her? Crystal realized at that moment that this matter was far more serious than she knew. If she kept holding back, then she would have to stand here and watch as every Shield Cross Stars member on board died. Even if some died beneath her rampage, they would just have to be sacrificed. Lionel sensed the towering aura behind erupt moments later, but a smile spread across his face. It seems that she's quite smart. And cruel at that. Unfortunately. Lionel's figure flickered to the side. Dream step. He slid by Cristal's blow by a hair, her fist gliding just over his shoulder and by his cheek. In fact, if all he did was shift to the side, her equally as monstrously sized chest would slam into his back. But that was exactly what he wanted. Star fusion, combustion. Boom. An eruption of red force flooded out of Lionel's body, his strength increasing so explosively that his bones cracked and his skin splintered. His hands reached up and he grabbed Cristal's elbow with two strong hands. The Cross Elder's eyes opened wide, but Lionel had already dropped his hips, twisting his core and powering through his legs with his greatest might. Flares of foggy crimson force billow out from his armor as he roared. Cristal flipped over his shoulder, arms flailing as she tried to fly to change her momentum. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough. She flew right into the fusion core, blazing with energy. Boom. Chapter 2242. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 43 seconds AM. Chapter 2242. Danger if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2242. Danger. Lionel raised up his hand, his mage core flaring as he roared. If he left things like this, then he and everyone else on this ship would die. Throwing someone into the fusion core wasn't enough to set it off, it was designed to be far more stable than that, and the entire ship was built around this design. However, a rampaging ancestor trying to save her own life was a completely different matter entirely. But he was prepared. The moment he had scanned through the ship, he had already been ready to deal with this particular outcome, as he had already deduced that this would be the easiest method he could use to deal with an ancestor. While it was true that he had improved greatly, it wasn't enough to close this sort of gap. He could now read and react to ancestors, but if he wanted to deal a death blow to them, he could only rely on this sort of method. His dream force flourished, rushing into the channels of force arts that maintained the fusion core and solidifying them. He roared as he poured 90% of his force into the closest lines and then began modifying those on the outside, morphing their structures and forcing them into more and more powerful states. The explosion was suddenly contained. Heat blasted into Lionel's body, threatening to rip him to pieces. But once again this was what he feared the least. A wide grin spread across his face. He had gained a Tier 1 starship so cheaply. He had already improved enough to modify the Tier 2 starship, but now this would be yet another boon. He really wanted to see who would be able to stand up to his fleet of improved starships. He could see Cristal's face as she continued to struggle. Her armor had already melted, pouring over her skin and melding into her bone. Her limbs had vanished as she focused all of her force into the most important organs of her body and her head, and this woman actually continued to roar. If nothing else, she was a fighter. Your soul will do me nicely. Boom. Cristal vanished, burned to ash, and the fusion core collapsing under her might, only to be reined in by Lionel's own. The starship rumbled and dimmed, its power constructs fading as the channels were interrupted. It tipped over, but it continued to stay in the skies. The real problem was that without its protective force fields, its effect on gravity was immense, and instead of it falling toward the planets, it was instead the planets that began to be pulled toward it. Lionel's gaze flickered. He had been forced to disrupt the channel so that he could stabilize the core. He knew this would happen, but one problem at a time, right? And dash. OV/L. B/I. And he had to re-establish the channels, and that would take time. By then, the planets below would be ripped out of their usual alignment. Although he was confident in succeeding before they came crashing into the ship, it would still be too late to save the original balance. Unless... At that moment, a familiar gray-blue-skinned little boy god appeared in his senses, raiding the hourglass and freezing the planets in place. Lionel's lip curled and he got to work. It took him a few hours, much more than he had thought it would. But that was the thing with destroying things, it was far faster to do so than it was to build them back up. After he was done, he rushed out, still slaughtering all of the Shield Cross-Star members that he came across. They weren't innocents, they were shoulders, and he didn't have the room nor the care to take prisoners. He appeared before a particular door and saw Aina, or rather the Emperor, within. She didn't seem to notice that he was there until he opened the gates. When she saw Lionel, her reaction wasn't as Lionel had expected at all. Aina opened her mouth to say something, but then she hesitated, forcing herself to calm down. She didn't know what kind of state Lionel was in, but the last time she had seen him, well, it was safe to say that their usual banter wouldn't fly. Aina Brazinger holding her tongue? I think I need to document this momentous occasion, Lionel said, nodding to himself as though seeing something spectacular. Aina was caught off guard and then suddenly furious. What are you trying to say? Am I a woman who doesn't understand propriety? Lionel coughed. Well, let's just say I only dared to say as much because you're in chains. There's really no better time, no? Aina glared at him, one part relieved, another part feeling that this change was far too easy, and yet another part feeling like ripping his face apart. You absolute idiot, do I look like the type of person who gets caught so easily? In this body, I could have ripped that foul woman apart 10 times over, in doing something important, and you just went and ruined it. Lionel smiled. He had guessed this the moment he saw Aina's expression after noticing him, but he didn't feel too bad about it because what was done, at least in this case anyway. Also, he could tell that her frustration didn't really come from him either. It was likely that upon her capture she had suffered quite a lot, but she had forced herself to hold back her usually violent temper. That straight-laced ancestor he had just killed would have definitely made her life a living hell. She was probably looking forward to turning things on their head, but then he had appeared. Then what's your original plan? Lionel asked. I have a helpful little boy outside, it might make things easier on us. Little boy? Aina asked, listening to her speak in such a rough and deep voice, when he had grown used to that sonorous, siren-like melody of a voice, was far easier than Lionel had accepted. It was as though the moment he realized this was Aina, he fell in love again. Of course. He would never tell his boys that he was looking upon a middle-aged man with such fondness in his eyes. I'd have to take that one to the grave. Forget it, this matter is bigger than you know. I don't know why you're in your original body, but if you only have 7th dimensional strength, you're in danger. Chapter 2243, published at 16th of October 2023, 11:59 and 42 seconds AM. Chapter 2243, shredded to pieces. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2243, shredded to pieces. Lionel's gaze flashed. I just killed an ancestor, this lack of belief is hurtful. Aina rolled her eyes. Even in that body, it seemed that she oozed feminine charm. It was funny watching a middle-aged man act like this. He would probably be mortified if he were anywhere in there. He had spent all of his life being a dignified emperor, only for this to happen. Poor guy. I don't have many details, but I know that someone was waiting and expecting all of this to happen. More than half of the Silver Empire's galaxies were wiped out in an instant, and our fighting force was crushed. Even those that survived were suddenly ripped apart by the wild shift in gravity. I barely managed to hold on to the capital as it was. You know this, I entered the Silver Empire's zone before and I got a technique out of it. It's the technique that allowed me to assimilate with real demon blood and create my own demonic form. For whatever reason, these people are very interested in this technique and are doing whatever they can to get their hands on it. I was originally in a battle with them before Shield Cross Stars came on official business, and they vanished. You don't know who they are? Lionel asked. I can't be certain, but they felt a lot like the people we met in the Cataclysm Zone, but more mature and stronger. Their foundations were incredibly solid, and their force manipulation, as you called it, was off the charts. Luckily, the Silver Emperor's body was incredibly powerful too. Lionel frowned. He felt confused, like countless stories were piling together in a manner that didn't quite make sense to him, and he still didn't understand how this matter might be related to the timeless event. According to his understanding, the Dream Project couldn't be created by the Cataclysm Zone's families and pavilions on their own. Instead, they relied on a favor the Plutos owed to the Fox, gaining the incomplete worlds, and then using it for their experimentation. There was likely some point in that timeline where they stabbed the Fox family in the back, and Earth became his grandfather's contingency plan, or maybe it was his plan all along, he wasn't certain. The likely purpose of the Dream Project was to strengthen the Cataclysm Zone so they could deal with an upcoming threat, likely demons that were adjacent to their world. As such, it made sense that they might send people in to steal a technique capable of allowing them to assimilate with demons. This wasn't what confused Lionel. He wanted to know how these matters were woven into one another and how they might come back to tie into the timeless event. He felt like he was missing just one kernel that might weave all of these things together. Were they wrapped in black chains and golden runes? Lionel asked. Aina, who was about to continue, stopped. How'd you know? She hadn't been there to witness the death of Lionel's father, so she didn't know how Lionel could possibly know these things. But yes, it was true that they had looked like that. I've seen them before. On that day, Lionel said lightly. Aina fell into silence. She knew what Lionel was talking about before he even explained. She wanted to comfort him, but he spoke before that. Continue. I realized immediately that there was something wrong with the appearance of Shield Cross stars. Their appearance was too timely. Wouldn't they want to deal with the Silver Empire too? Lionel asked. According to the history of the human domain, the Silver Empire was always a scourge. They were just too powerful to deal with immediately, so they were tolerated. Of course, this all wrapped back to the fact that they were demons. I would have thought so too, but I've learned a lot, speaking and questioning attendants and such. I assumed that all of this was related to the zone, which was why I was following it all to the end. According to my understanding, everything in the human domain has been peaceful for a long while. Everyone accepted the Silver Empire's demon status as something that was just part of their power. Lionel nodded slowly. Indeed, it had always sounded like an excuse to him. The Morales and the Suyard both had clearly demonic characters in their lineage factors, so why weren't they treated the same? Something didn't add up. It seems that no one turned on the Silver Empire until they were suddenly greatly weakened, and then they swooped in. If what you're saying is correct, it's even odder. Those people who were capable of battling, your father should be supremely powerful. There's no reason for them to fear the appearance of Shield Cross stars unless there was another reason. The pieces were slowly coming together, becoming clearer in Lionel's mind. Of course he had been If the four great families could target the Fox family, destroying them, even though the latter was the reason they had a chance at all to grow powerful, then who was to say that there wasn't more internal strife in the Cataclysm Zone complete world? Even further than just that, they had the tablets that could grant them the Northern Star lineage factor, and on top of that, somehow, in the past, the Fox family had been strong enough to have the Pluto race owe them a favor. How else could they have been that strong if not by the most obvious answer? It all lined up slowly. Those henchmen of the god-beast of destruction had yet to vanish from the world. They were still making their presence known, and they were trying to sink their claws into one of the few remaining human bubbles. It was almost obvious. After such a war, how could there be many humans left if even the god-beasts had practically gone extinct? Any that remained would be first on the chopping block. They were probably being ripped apart by the sheer number of forces trying to take control of them. /O-V/IL. B/I/. And at that moment it happened. The veil that Elryan had put upon the planets in order to keep them in alignment was shredded to pieces. Lionel's gaze sharpened. Chapter 2244. Published at 16th of October 2023 11:59 and 24 seconds AM. Chapter 2244. Horizon. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2244. Horizon. Lionel stomped, disrupting the force arts beneath him and releasing the shackles that had bound Aina. Her expression couldn't help but change. It definitely shouldn't have been so simple. She might not be a crafter, but she had some understanding of the profession, and though she knew Lionel was excellent, he hadn't reached the point of being able to ignore everything, or else it wouldn't have been so difficult for him to deal with the starship of the Omen family. But now, it felt like he looked at this level of craftsmanship as though it was child's play. It had only been less than a day since the last time she saw him. Her expression flickered with a hint of a complex emotion. Lionel's greatest fear in the past was that his compassion would vanish and his truest self would be unveiled, causing him to disregard the lives of the people he had once wanted to become a king in order to protect. However, the fears of everyone else should have been very different. If the Lionel of the past was gone and he spent every day seriously plotting to improve himself toward a goal, then just what would he accomplish? She had always been a hard worker, but Lionel always seemed to keep up with her steps effortlessly. This wasn't something that she had ever told him about, but it left her feeling a bit uncomfortable, not because she was jealous, but because she felt that he might very well leave her behind one day. It was an odd emotion for her, especially since the reason she trained so hard wasn't for the sake of keeping up with Lionel, but rather to gain revenge for her mother. The fact she had such thoughts left her feeling guilty on two fronts, one being that of Lionel and her hope that he would slow down somewhat, and the second being that of her mother who she felt should be her sole focus. These were things that she could never bring herself to speak about with Lionel because she felt that they were just as ridiculous as the thoughts that had caused her to leave him in the first place, a decision she still regretted to this day. Also, what kind of girlfriend would she be pouring her problems onto Lionel when it was he who needed support now and not him? In all of her swirl of emotions triggered by a simple action of Lionel's, she shook when Lionel suddenly vanished. She saw that smirk on his face and snorted. Lionel appeared on the outside of the starship with great speed. However, when he got there, he found the back of a broken silver armor. His lip couldn't help but twitch. "You're slow," Aina said lightly, hiding away her grin with her broad shoulders and back. Lionel opened his mouth to respond, but he closed it. Aina snickered, loving every minute, but soon neither of them could focus on their banter at all because what was happening below seemed to be nothing? They frowned. Aina obviously didn't know who El Ryan was just yet, but she had sensed it as well. There had just been a large and sturdy barrier, but it had vanished. No, it had been unceremoniously shattered by an overwhelming strength. So who had done it? Where had it gone? Aina's first instinct was the large gray-blue man who made her heart skip a beat, radiating a danger that put her on guard. But when she saw that Lionel didn't mind him, she knew that there was something deeper going on here, and it had nothing to do with this man. "You know him?" Aina asked. "Ah, the little boy, yeah, he's alright, I guess." "Little?" "Don't say that with so much shock, you'll make me think him lacking something," Lionel pouted. Aina rolled her eyes. Was it just her, or had this man become more insufferable? How he could still flirt with her when she was in this body was beyond her, but it also somewhat warmed her heart. "I didn't think you'd be so flirty. Is there something you want to tell me?" "Ah," Lionel placed a hand to his chest. "If this is your way of asking me if I want to introduce a third to our bedroom, he'll have to reject, thank you. I'm not a fan of Sharon Dash." A kick landed on Lionel's chest, sending him flying back into the flagship. El Ryan caught this matter in his periphery, and he really wanted to be happy about it. But it was coming. "Can't you choose your words more carefully?" Aina put her hands on her hip, another amusing sight. If someone else had said something like that, you would have probably put their head on a pike. Lionel coughed between his laughter. She wasn't wrong, but that only made it funnier. Boom. Lionel's eyes widened. His internal sight hadn't caught onto what was happening at all. It just suddenly appeared, a hand the size of a planet, extending out from one of the many factories beneath. He realized that it wasn't that he had been neglectful, but rather the very same protections that the Raypax had against his senses. He deployed his dream domain instantly, but to his shock, even this was useless. Even the Raypax couldn't hide from the deployment of his dream world, but then he remembered. His lineage factor had changed. How could he still deploy his dream world at all? He no longer had the 3 domains of the starry-tailed fox. His perception changed and the way he used his dream world changed once again. But he realized that even then it was still useless. All of this happened in an instant, even as he was rushing to his feet. When he laid his eyes on it, his heart grew stone cold. It wasn't a hand at all, it was a shadow that seemed to cover the skies to infinity, reaching up like it had no limits and appearing before El Ryan in an instant. The Pluto was set flying back, his still injured chest caving in even further as he flashed so far into the distance he looked like one of the many stars on the horizon. N0VL1 and Lionel was certain. One of the god beast of destruction's henchmen, the Shadow Tail, had appeared. Chapter 2245. Published at 17th of October 2023 11:40 and 44 seconds AM. Chapter 2245. Damned woman, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2245. Damned woman. Lionel's pupils constricted into pinholes. "Aina!" he roared. Up until this point, aside from his father, El Ryan was simply the strongest person he had ever come across. Although he had been injured by the entity and only had a fraction of his peak strength remaining, he had attacked that very same man with the full brunt of his modified starship and hadn't even managed to cut his wrist off completely, what should have supposedly been one of the weakest parts of his body. But now, that very same El Ryan, while holding his family's strongest treasure at that, was blown away as though a leaf in the wind. The strength of this monstrous creature wasn't something that he could fathom. And the most horrible part was that even after he had attacked, the regulator showed no intention of taking action. Aina had already acted. In fact, she was happy that she had sent Lionel flying into the starship as well, because even though she was shaking in fear currently, she couldn't imagine what would happen to Lionel if he was struck like that. Lionel stood in a fury, but Aina was already attacking. N-O-V/E/1. B-I/N. Damned woman. Howdy. Lionel caught him, surprised by what he had been about to say, but that didn't calm his rage at all. He was far too furious to think about it with much depth. His thoughts were entirely occupied with how to get out of this situation. But that only lasted a second before the rage spilled over once again. Why didn't she listen to him? There was clearly a huge gap between them, a gap that couldn't be closed with her style of battle. The smart thing would be to rely on his style of battle instead. No matter how much she hated it, it was clear and obvious that his more devious, long-game, calculation-intensive approach to battle was the far better approach here. And yet, she had just stormed in as though he needed to be protected to her back. It was cute, funny even when they were in normal settings and he allowed her to take the lead. It was light-hearted, and he didn't mind because he was confident in himself not to care. He loved her, and that was enough for him to allow her to do as she pleased in 99% of situations. But in this 1%, in these dangerous situations, in times where their lives were on the line, she had to listen to him. She had to let him stand in front of her, no matter what she perceived her strength to be. Lionel dashed forward at his greatest possible speed. The appearance of the shadow tail and the destruction of the barrier of time and space had been far too volatile and violent, causing his spatial force to be useless. He ran forward even though he knew it was foolish, even though he knew it would change nothing. His best weapon was the ship he had just been in. Even his modified ships were at least 20% weaker than a true Tier 1 starship, and yet he ignored it all. But he was far too slow. Without the use of external force, he was just a Tier 1 of the 7th dimension. He wasn't a member of the god races, he wasn't even one of the many races just a step below, he was a human, he was weak. Aina punched out with the full strength that she could muster. All of her previous injuries seemed to have vanished, but they had only been that facades she used to let the members of S.H.I.E.L.D. Cross Stars think that they had been able to catch her. In reality, she had already long since surpassed the former Silver Emperor, and not just by a small margin at that. It gave her confidence. Confidence that vanished in the face of this beast. But she had to stand before it. She gave her everything, throwing out a strike that was the greatest of her life. It was far too similar. A strike that gave everything to protect the person they cared so much for to their back. Lionel's gaze turned a furious shade of red, trying to tap into a power hidden deep within him. But then he saw a smile. It was just a pair of cherry lips, graceful and beautiful, enticing and soft, so gorgeous it could make a man forget everything in his life to worship at the feet of its owner. He only saw it for a brief moment, and then the power that he couldn't even control, power he wasn't confident in pulling out of himself in the first place, vanished like a puff of wind. It was as though that smile was teasing him, holding a piece of meat right in front of his face. It was insulting, patronizing, the lowest form of instigation. And it worked. Aina's fist landed, and an overwhelming force swallowed her up. Lionel couldn't spot anything but a mist of blood. Bits and pieces of something shattered, sent flying so far into the distance, and at such a fast speed he didn't even have the time to catch her. Dead. Dead again? Another one? So quickly? He had just. Lionel roared, his fury rising like an overwhelming tide. I'll kill you. I swear I'll kill you. I'll shred apart everything you care for. I'll grind your pride into the dirt and make you face that sick smile. It didn't matter how loud he roared, how violently his blood boiled, that same overwhelming power didn't come. That smile didn't even appear again. It was as though it couldn't be bothered to stick around to listen to the tantrum of a child. She had already seen the amusing expression she had wanted to see. She was bored now and wanted to entertain herself with something else. However, none of this stopped Lionel's furious bellow. What did was the shadow tail suddenly turning on him, curving through the air as though it didn't have a form and smashing toward him. Chapter 2246. Published at 17th of October 2023 11:40 and 43 seconds AM. Chapter 2246. Fear if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2246. Fear. Lionel watched the shadow tail come toward him, his body and his very soul seething. The veins in his eyes popped and seemed to roar all on their own, breaking and pulsing. They shattered, blood leaking from his eyes and splitting over. However, just as quickly as they appeared, they erupted into a burning flame. Streaks of fire ran down his cheeks as he watched the shadow tail get closer and closer, but he didn't move, he didn't even seem to react at all. The flames dripped down his body, blazing with greater and greater fervor. She called me a destruction sovereign, Lionel suddenly said, as though he was speaking to the shadow tail that approached him. In the vastness of space, their distance between one another couldn't even be described in simple kilometers and miles any longer, and yet it crossed this seemingly impossible distance with such speed that it only seemed normal that Lionel couldn't react. She said I shouldn't exist, that she felt the need to kill me for that. Is that what your people told her? Did you use a similar reason to target my father? Was he too great a threat to you? A variable you couldn't deal with? So much so that you had to use a coward's path to deal with him? Couldn't even face him yourself? Too scared to fall to a single spear strike? The shadow tail was moving even faster, the distance closing with such speed that it was already upon Lionel. It didn't even seem to respond, as though it never understood his words. But Lionel continued speaking as though it didn't matter to him one way or another. Is that all you mighty races are worth? All the backbone you have? Are you that easily scared? Lionel looked up. His gaze no longer even seemed to be a gaze, it was rather two blazing balls of red-gold flames, flickering with the brightness of a twin pair of stars. In that case, I'll give you something to truly fear. Remember this promise, you and the rest of your kind. I, Lionel Morales, will not rest until every single last one of you is wiped from existence. Do you think I need this power? Do you think it matters if I don't have a fraction of your strength? Novel B. In the blazing fires, and Lionel's eyes seemed to catch the surface of the shadow tail, but they did absolutely nothing. They might as well have been a pair of gently blowing winds, gliding across its tough, black skin. The raging heat was worthless before its might. However, as insignificant as they were, the fires continued to flicker weakly, as though in sheer defiance, as Lionel spoke one last time. I swear that I will do these things, and I will do so as a human. That power, he would never use it again. Not until he crushed that smile beneath his feet, not until she understood with or without it, she wasn't worthy of mocking him. No one was. Not even this shadow tail. Not even while he was merely in the seventh dimension. Not even when a Pluto could do nothing before its might. Still within the range of the starship, having not moved nearly fast enough to get out of its way, Lionel suddenly stretched his dream force out, solidifying his dream world once more, but not to observe this shadow tail. Instead, he activated the defensive formation once again. Bang! The shadow tail shot through it as though it was nothing but a thin pane of glass. It was so swift that if not for the shattered motes of force, it would have been impossible to tell that there had been a barrier up at all. However, Lionel didn't even seem to care. In fact, Lionel wasn't standing in the same spot at all, he had already moved. He had deployed the barrier not to stop this monster before him, but rather as a stabilizing force. He used the power of the starship to still the raging force in the surroundings and allow him to use his spatial force once again. He appeared a long distance away, deep within the range of the starship and hovering over its body. His gaze only seemed to grow colder and colder, despite the raging flames only becoming hotter and hotter. Veins of red tore across his skin and the space around him cracked and fractured, collapsing and fissuring. Boom! The shadow tail tore through the Tier 1 starship as though it was papier-mâché. The strongest weapon of the human domain was worthless before it, a piece of tinfoil trash. It didn't matter what materials it was made out of, what could it do against an envoy of destruction? The ship was ripped to shreds, even the fusion core was absolutely useless. It flew through it as though it was nothing more than a slightly warm breeze, causing a deafening explosion that could be heard across the galaxy. It flung out so much matter that sound even traveled normally. Little lion. Lionel finally heard his mother screech. He had already sensed her appearance, but her force couldn't reach so far, and the vacuum of space hadn't allowed her voice to travel. It was only then that he registered her voice for only a moment before it was overwhelmed by the boom. However, his only thoughts were simple. He was here. So why was she worried? Lionel stretched out his hands, the bits and pieces of the starship, or rather the force arts that had once formed them together into a single existence, responded to his call even as the shadow tail closed the distance once more. You will be the first. At that moment, the scattered pieces of debris flying out in all directions, wildly and uncontrolled, froze into place under a mysterious power. They were linked, one after another, in a pattern that would be oh so familiar to anyone who had completed the trial puzzle of the dimensional cleanse zone. The power of the destroyed fusion core flooded into the surroundings, pooling away, and much of it being pulled into Lionel's control under his Scarlet Star force, strengthening the connection between the nodes. The world froze, and then Lionel and the shadow tail vanished. Silence fell and a vast emptiness was left behind. Lionel didn't know how long he watched the scene. Watching the shadow tail writhe in pain and horror, being slowly torn apart by the collapsing world around them, didn't move him. A godlike creature was being tortured beneath his schemes, beneath his own power, and yet he only felt that it was natural, a dense emptiness within his heart. He reached forward, grabbing its shredded body as it slowly breathed its last. It was enormous compared to his body. It was like an ant holding up a silverback gorilla, looking down at it like a hunting trophy. He could finally feel some emotion coming from it. It was palpable, hanging in the air like a thick curtain of heavy rain. Rage, fury, humiliation. Fear. Yes. Lionel spoke lightly. That's exactly what you should feel. It's what it'll make every single last one of you feel. Chapter 2247. Published at 17th of October 2023 11:40 and 41 seconds AM. Chapter 2247. Stunned speechless. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2247. Stunned speechless. Lionel walked out from seemingly nowhere, a corpse as large as a moon, and only getting bigger, hanging from his silver, white gold arm. The Shadow Tail's body seemed to be losing its form slowly, or what small bit of form it had once had, the longer it spent dead. Its billowing dark force spread out, and as it did so, its large, mangled body expanded as though there was a balloon within it. He was so small compared to the corpse of the Shadow Tail that it was almost impossible to tell that the former was being carried at all. It seemed more like the beast was languid, beaten and battered with injuries, and it was only now slowly making its way back. As for Lionel, his gaze was vacant and empty. They held an unfathomable depth, one worn and torn by the ages. There was one person, though, who noticed him immediately. Eleanor, or rather Eleanor in the body of a woman he didn't recognize, rushed forward with her greatest speed. However, in the devastation, and especially after being blown so far back by the destruction of the fusion core, just how far was that distance? Who could stop a grieving mother, though? It had been hours since Lionel had disappeared, and Eleanor had already pried herself forward, looking through the debris of the destroyed Tier 1 starship. When she saw the Shadow Tail suddenly appear, she rushed forward in a fury. But when she noticed its startling lack of a reaction, and then saw that it was actually being carried, her tears spilled forward in a torrent. She rushed forward and buried Lionel's head into her chest, holding on to him maybe more tightly than she should have. She seemed to have completely forgotten that to Lionel, she should have just been a random woman he had never met before, but she couldn't be bothered to deal with this. She didn't care how Lionel had defeated the Shadow Tail, she didn't care where he had gone, she didn't care about the zone or what challenges they had passed or failed. She just pulled in her son as tightly as she could, and Lionel let her do as he pleased. He stood there, silently listening to the sobs of his mother. After a long while he spoke, "There's never a need to worry when I'm here. I promise." Eleanor only cried harder when she heard this. These words, they were all too familiar. She had tried her best to not show Lionel her tears, to not show weakness, to be the same strong pillar that her husband had been, but the loss was weighing heavy on her, and just now she thought that she had lost even her son. She wasn't strong enough, not nearly strong enough. Her son shouldn't have to say such words to her, her husband shouldn't have had to say such words to her, she should have been able to stand in front of the former and stand beside the latter, and yet all she could do was hold them and cry. "I'm sorry, little lion, Mom is sorry." Lionel didn't say anything. He had already said all he needed to say. He might understand how his mother felt or how Aina had felt, but soon, there would come a day where their hearts could lay to rest and their calm could return, a day when their confidence in him was just as high as his confidence in himself. And if not, then the day where there was no one left to threaten them would come first. Eleanor pulled back, teary-faced, looking into the abyss of her son's eyes. She didn't seem surprised to see this. She had observed Lionel for far longer than he knew, at least until recently. She understood him better than most, which was exactly why she had never tried to coddle his feelings. But it was ironic. She said that she would be a true mother, and yet she had indulged her son instead of doing the opposite. It was embarrassing. She wasn't all that far from 100 years old, relatively speaking, but she still didn't quite understand how to be a parent. It was hard to accept. She had been talented all her life, and it could be said that she rarely came across any roadblocks but this. She didn't quite know what to do. "He'll be back," Lionel said lightly before Eleanor could make up her mind. He took a step and vanished into the distance. Eleanor's shoulders trembled, but she bit her lip hard, so hard that blood dribbled down her chin. She didn't have a decision, but the one thing she knew was that her tears wouldn't fix anything. Lionel moved into the distance, crossing large distances. "Anastasia," Lionel said. Is the snow globe large enough to take this thing? You want to keep it? I can't leave it lying around just anywhere, and I feel like I might be able to use it to strengthen my lineage factors with." His voice trailed off. He wanted to say Aina's help, but his intention switched. If Aina's skill increased enough, she could definitely succeed. If he wanted to use it to form an armor, he didn't know if even his current self, with all the improvement he had made, was enough to process this envoy of destruction into a divine armor. It was a task so complex he couldn't wrap his mind around it, and he had yet to ever use living existences in his armor. He didn't even quite know if it was possible. None of the current snow globes can contain it, but I can do something about that. N0-Velb-1N thanks, Lionel said lightly. The corpse suddenly vanished from his hand, but not before a certain Pluto caught sight of it from the distance. Elryan's tongue felt both tied and frozen. That creature that had shaken him to his core was dead? It was dead? And by the hands of this human? No, the timeless event, it surely revolved around this creature, no? What did that mean for it then? Just how? He was stunned, speechless. Chapter 2248. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 47 seconds AM. Chapter 2248. What good was it? If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2248. What good was it? The Pluto race youth was in a sorry state. It was already odd seeing someone so heavily injured not bleed even a drop of blood, but that was maybe the constant state of the Pluto race. On the rare occasion that they were actually hurt, that is. What happened? Lionel walked by the Elryan, ignoring him. He could spare a few words for his mother, but Elryan wasn't such a person to him. In fact, if he could kill Elryan and take the hourglass, he would do so. Unfortunately, he would have to waste his best opportunity to get his hands on that item until he could figure out a method to take it away without it ripping his arm from his shoulder. Elryan's gaze flickered, but he didn't say anything. Lionel had already been in a bad state when he met him, but this. Lionel continued to walk. The further he got out of the range of the original battlefield, the further he could blink ahead. Eventually he made it. In the depths of space, there was no wind, no resistance, and the forces in action were so weak that once something started flying in a certain direction, getting it to stop was just hoping that it crashed into a planet. But in the vastness of this emptiness, that was like hoping a sewing line would thread itself into a needle cast into the ocean off the back of a wave. There was too much darkness, too much emptiness. But that also meant that if something flew in a single direction, you would almost always find it continuing in that said direction. At the same speed, at the same pace. The first thing Lionel saw was red. A blob of rouge that surged through the skies, scattered like a smear of paint. There wasn't even the semblance of a body remaining, there was nothing body blood, even the flesh was minced so fine that it looked not much different. The fact there was anything at all remaining, though, was quite surprising. Lionel had begun his journey, thinking that he wouldn't find anything at all. Maybe he would walk in this direction to the ends of the universe and never find the remains of Aina. He felt his heart lurch as he stood there. He didn't even know why he had come, it was just as foolish as his actions had been previously. He knew that if he found anything, it would be exactly this, a spattering of blood, drawn across the endless darkness of space, a ghastly gore that even the twinkling stars in the distance couldn't seem to brighten. There was no breath, no life, nothing. And why would there be? There wasn't even a body to hold it. That rage that Lionel thought he had vented, watching the shadow tail writhe and squirm in its last moments, came back even more furious. They should have grown old together. They should have had a school of children. He should have crowned each one of them little princes and princesses, allowing them to live a life of freedom and leisure. He gripped his fists so hard that the small bones in his hands cracked one after another, his nails splintering, but he couldn't seem to feel it at all. He knew it was all useless. He had allowed Aina to separate her soul. The destruction of her body shouldn't have been the end of her, but how could such a blow not shatter any semblance of an ethereal glabella that she had? And even if it hadn't, this zone would have forced her soul to fuse with the body of the Silver Emperor. There was no telling if the benefits would still be the same. Without an ethereal glabella, her soul would have dissipated from her body even quicker. After he had spent hours battling the shadow tail, it was impossible that there would still be a soul here for him to awaken. He gripped his fists harder. The shadow tail was targeting everyone. It targeted him immediately after dealing with Aina. He didn't have the strength to ignore it and go after Aina immediately. He could only sit and wait for it to die, dancing on the edge of life and death until he could finally return. But he knew it was useless. Even if he had been able to go after Aina immediately, the speed of the blow was so great, and she was moving so fast, that by the time he finally caught up, her soul would have already dissipated. The only reason she had even slowed down enough for him to catch up at all was because her body had dispersed into countless pieces and the force was distributed across them. Ironically, the reason he could see her again even in this case, was because she was nothing more than a mist of blood. Lionel closed his his heart threatening to beat out of his chest. Suddenly his eyes opened wide. His actions seemed to be a step ahead of his thoughts as he opened a palm, a golden tablet appearing within. He had taken it out of Aina's room, or rather their room. Aina had stopped staying in her own room a long time ago. Something clicked for Lionel. He reached forward, his vital star force blazing to life, and it sparked like blue lightning, jumping from his finger and toward the first blob of blood. At the same time, his hand that held the tablet pulsed. N/0 Velb 1 NAS. Though a magnet, the globules of blood, connected by vital star force, roared to life and surged into the tablet. Lionel frowned. He had acted practically on instinct, as though his body wasn't his own. He knew that vital star force was the life force of the body, but what good was it if there was no soul or ethereal glabella? The root of one's life was one's soul force and dream force. He had seen many examples already of people living with their bodies destroyed but their souls intact. It didn't even make sense to him that the vice versa could happen. What did it mean to have a body without a soul? Wouldn't it just be an empty carcass? What good would it be to regain Aina's corpse? In fact, it might not even look like Aina, it would just be a middle-aged man's naked body. Chapter 2249. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 46 seconds AM. Chapter 2249. A pair of sovereigns. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2249. A pair of sovereigns. Lionel's pupils constricted. The blood came together, forming a connection with the tablet, but what shocked him the most was the form it took. It was Aina, most definitely Aina. Although it was like a liquid mass of crimson, and it was a body formed entirely of blood without the slightest hint of flesh and bone, he would recognize that body anywhere. In fact, he recognized it even before the details of her face fully formed and strands of long blood hairs took shape as well. However, after being shocked for a moment, Lionel closed his eyes and sighed. It still had no soul. He had gotten a foolish rush of hope just now when even someone from third-dimensional Earth would be able to understand what was going on. A single cell of the body carried all the DNA information one needed about a person. That sequence would be able to decide everything. It was probably possible from those of higher dimensional worlds to reform a body out of a single drop of blood, and even take some guesses as to what kind of personality the person in question might have had. Of course, this was possible in higher dimensional worlds because it was possible even on modern Earth. It quite literally meant nothing that this blood was able to take the shape of Aina's real body. In fact, if a blood sovereign tablet wasn't capable of at least this much, then what worth would it have? How would it still dare to call itself such a thing? The only real oddity is that it managed to pull out Aina's body from within the Silver Emperor's body, a feat that Lionel had only seen the entity accomplish so easily, but even that made perfect sense. And O/V/L-B-1 And the human race was one connected to the god-beasts of both creation and destruction. Lionel didn't believe that it was a coincidence that this golden tablet shared the same color as the Fox Golden Tablet, and most importantly, what he assumed would be the Northern Star Lineage Factor's two golden tablets. For them to share the same form as the Northern Star Lineage Factor, it wasn't too large of a leap to assume that all of the tablets originated from the god-beasts. The humans were able to retain some of them even after the war, and for whatever reason the other races hadn't targeted them for possession. Though, even that might not necessarily be true. From Lionel's understanding, the Cataclysm Zone was in great danger, and that was the reason for the existence of these simulation worlds in the first place. It could very well be that these tablets were precisely what their enemies were targeting. That would also explain why they had held such a competition when Lionel had been there and why they allowed the youths to trade for them. Though Lionel hadn't exactly traded for this golden tablet, he didn't gather nearly enough points. This was all to say that if there was a treasure that could accomplish what that entity had, then it was these very golden tablets. Even this wasn't too surprising. Lionel's gaze softened somewhat as he looked at the bloody mist that had formed into Aina. He felt a pressure on his chest increase before he pressed it down. It was exactly while he was focused on this that Aina's figure was sucked into the tablet. His heart skipped a beat and he pulled the tablet back hurriedly, but it was already too late. He felt a panic in his heart. He had no idea what this tablet wanted to do, and his understanding of the blood sovereign path was far too limited. Even so, from his understanding, devouring blood was practically the baseline of how all of these abilities worked. What if that was exactly what this tablet wanted to do? But it was too late. He couldn't do anything as it rushed in, even ripping away a large portion of his vital star force and practically sucking his 3 vital stars out of his body. His body went limp and he stumbled in the air, almost falling over entirely. Beaten and haggard, he looked toward the tablet with a listless expression, unable to even see straight and proper any longer. And then everything fell into silence. There was no magical revival, no sudden change, no earth-shuddering, jaw-dropping transformations. There was just nothing. Lionel drifted in the emptiness, not saying anything. The despair on his face had already faded and he simply did nothing, thought nothing, not moving at all. He probably should have felt rage, and that he did, but he had already reached such a peak that it simply simmered and smoldered over the hot, ashy coals of his heart. He had reached such a depth of wrath and fury that it simply became nothing but a bright sheet of white, reflecting on his face as indifference and coldness. He didn't know how long passed, but he simply stood, placing the golden tablet back into his and Aina's room. He walked back slowly, not noticing the smoky blackness under the soles of his feet. When he turned, he realized that Elryan was still there. He seemed to be trying to keep a respectful distance. Not that that meant much when he could quite literally see for thousands of miles away, as though it was all right before his face. Looking at the soles of Lionel's feet, and the smoky ash coming out from the sides of his eyes, Elryan paused. "You are a destruction sovereign?" Lionel didn't answer, he simply kept walking. Destruction sovereign? God beast of destruction? He wouldn't be surprised if they were related somehow, and even less if Elryan tried to kill him for it. However, he was truly not in the mood. If the Pluto race wanted to lose a junior today, he would gladly oblige. She's a blood sovereign? Lionel, who had ignored Elryan to this point, looked toward him, his eyes carrying a smoldering sharpness. Elryan could even feel the heat on his own eyes. Had he not been a Pluto, his eyes would have already combusted. Then you can probably save her. Chapter 2250? Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 45 seconds AM. Chapter 2250. While if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2250. While Lionel didn't say anything, and his expression didn't change. He simply stood there and waited. Blood sovereigns are different from the rest of us. Sovereigns in general. Being a sovereign is like catching a glimpse of the life state before stepping foot into it truly. The life state was the second last state of force manipulation there was. It represented, apparently, the so-called second dimension, a dimension in which only the regulator could exist in. It was apparently where the spark of life, and the way little Nana's elder brother had described it, it made Lionel think of the Big Bang Theory of Earth. An instant of time that was both instant and yet infinite. It was a beautiful picture that he wasn't in the headspace to admire. It's that faint hint of the life state that allows your force to have seemingly inexplicable properties. It's why your spear force can recognize what is and isn't a spear, and it's also why it can swallow up lesser spear forces. Though, if your enemy was of the life state, this ability would be rendered useless unless you were likewise in the life state. Elryan shook his head, feeling that he was explaining too much. For some reason, beneath Lionel's gaze, he felt that he was in the presence of his father, and he wanted to over-explain himself rather than under-explain. But even this thought felt ridiculous. His father was an existence the like of which could force existence itself to tremble. He couldn't fathom comparing him to Lionel. And yet here he was. Each sovereign is special in their own way, and you can either be born with the ability, or you can comprehend it yourself, though the latter is far more difficult. The blood sovereign is special in that its sovereign state is a physical manifestation of its body, same for similarly titled sovereigns that don't fall into the usual weapon force categories. The reason ninth-dimensional existences are so hard to kill is because the life state is birthed into their bodies once they enter that realm. The separation between powerful ninth-dimensional existence and weak ones is whether or not they've comprehended this kernel of life state or not. For many ninth-dimensional existences, especially the ones you'll come across, this kernel is the only sense of the life state that they'll gain in their entire lives. Even for those that do comprehend this kernel, many of their forces will still be stuck at the impetus state. However, this won't stop their strength from being elevated to an extreme level. You might have guessed it by now with this explanation, but blood sovereigns gather their power from their own blood. They're adept at manipulating it and using it to swallow the blood of others. In order to do that and not lose themselves, a part of their soul is always dispersed within their blood, but that's not important. Even if it wasn't, she could still be saved. That's because her very blood is laced with the life state already. She is essentially like a ninth-dimensional expert in that she can't be killed so easily without the help of someone of a regulator or someone that can somewhat ignore a regulator. She's only really missing one thing. Ryan looked off toward where Aina's body had been as though remembering the sight of something. But it seems like you already have that one thing. She's like a ninth-dimensional expert, but she isn't truly one. Her force hasn't reached a high enough state to exist for long periods of time. If too much time passed, she would truly die. However, you have vital star force, the life force of the body. So long as enough of her blood remains and you're able to get to her in time, you can use your vital star force to stimulate her revival. You also seem to have the perfect vessel for her too. The only problem is, your vital star force has to at least be in the impetus state, and you're only half a step in. That's not enough. At best your vital star force can sustain her, but it can't revive her, and you'll need to give her quite a large amount every day. You're lucky that you happen to have the perfect force and it's at just the right level too. If it was only at the fourth layered state, it wouldn't be enough even to sustain her. Unfortunately, I do not have expertise in vital star force, nor do any of the companions I've brought. Or else I would try to help you. Lionel looked at Ryan for a long while and then nodded slowly. The smoldering smoke coming from the edges of his eyes and the soles of his bare feet edged away slightly and became almost imperceptible to the eye. Though they didn't fade entirely. Anastasia, Lionel said lightly. You know, I don't like your tone, young man. I can even count how many times older than you I am. She probably wouldn't have said this had Aina been definitely dead, but knowing there was a good chance to reverse all of this, she was in a good mood. And V/L-B-1-. And, how far away can you sense force? Lionel asked. In this broken world? Anywhere, she replied. Can you find out for me if there's a spiritual with a vital star force innate node? Or any race for that matter? She blinked, but she immediately understood. Although Lionel was just a half step from the impetus state, it wasn't so easy to cross. Having taken a half step, he could feel that impossibly vast chasm and he knew it might very well take even him years to cross that line. He refused to leave Aina in that state for years if he didn't have to. Innate nodes were cheat codes in increasing your force manipulation. So long as he fueled one for long enough, it would definitely be able to help him to cross that half step. But he needed the node first. Ryan's gaze flickered, but he didn't say anything. I can check, but you should know that even among spirituals not all of them have innate nodes, and those that do usually just awaken normal, middle-of-the-road, elemental innate nodes. The odds that one would have a vital star force innate node, especially given the fact that this isn't an aspect spirituals excel in, is very low. I will look, but just manage your expectations. It will also take me quite a while, probably a few days. Lionel nodded lightly. Chapter 2251. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10:41 AM. Chapter 2251. Smoldering. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2251. Smoldering. Lionel truly waited for those days. He didn't move, he didn't check on his mother, he simply meditated in the depths of space, without thought for water or food or even entertainment. His entire mind was focused on comprehending the path of the vital star force, the very path that he had maybe neglected the most until this point. He didn't rely entirely on Anastasia. In fact, he smartly made the assumption that she would fail. If this was the case, then he would have to do whatever he could to speed up the process as much as he could. He would not, leave Aina to be in that state for even a second longer than he had to. Ryan didn't move either. He might have been 14 years old, but time seemed irrelevant to him. He had the patience of a monk that had lived for an impossible number of years. He didn't say anything, and he even only seemed to breathe a few times a day. Slowly though, his injuries were becoming far better. By the end of the fourth day he had actually recovered a great deal. If others saw how long it was taking to be fully recovered, especially those that understood the true majesty of the Pluto race, they would be stunned speechless. This was a man who had healed his arm and leg being severed in an instant of time as though nothing at all had happened. It could only be said that those that had harmed him were truly monsters. I'm sorry, Lionel, there's no such innate node here. Lionel's eyes opened and he nodded lightly. He had already expected this. He rose to his feet, or rather let his feet fall from their meditating position, and stepped forward, crossing the distance to Ryan in an instant. He raised his foot again to take another step, but Ryan's large hand had landed on his shoulder. Or rather, half of his palm had. He was so much larger than Lionel that the other half of his hand hung off. I know you won't listen to me, but I feel like I should say this anyway. Absorbing the innate nodes of others will never be perfect. There will always be some hidden flaw, even if you use the best methods available to you or even me for that matter. When it comes time for you to become to enter the ninth dimension, it will only hold you back. If you want new nodes, the best course of action is to form them on your own. Lionel's turned a smoldering gaze toward El Ryan. Streams of black smoke, hot to the touch, were still coming out of the corners of his eyes and the soles of his feet. Though they were much weaker than they had been before, El Ryan still felt that searing pain when he met Lionel's gaze, and it was even more exaggerated now than it had been in the past. And El Ryan hesitated again. Killing is already a heavy enough burden on one's path forward. If you snatch things of importance from those that you kill on top of that, it will make things even more difficult. If even on top of that, what you snatch is of enough importance that you rely on it heavily to progress, the burden will be even heavier. And that's not just for you. If you use this method to help your loved one, she will suffer as well. Novi/LB. One and Lionel didn't say anything. El Ryan was talking about a concept so abstract that it was for anyone to wrap their heads around it, but he had already known it existed the moment that Anastasia had told him it was impossible to revive Aina's mother because Aina was too powerful. Those lines of time, of fate, of karma, whatever you wanted to call them, could bind anyone. And the more powerful you became, the heavier the burden became. There's no burden I can't carry, Lionel said before vanishing. El Ryan's lip twitched. He didn't even ask about how to forge his own innate nodes. But in the end, El Ryan sighed. What would be the point if he had? One could only do such a thing when given an extremely special opportunity, and even that wasn't necessarily without risks. Lionel was learning firsthand just how dangerous it was to have powerful innate nodes. If he took one from others as he already had, or if he forged new ones, it would be even more dangerous. This was such an important rule that even El Ryan himself only had a single innate node. His father refused to allow him to forge more, although he definitely could. He could even replace all 10 of his nodes with innate nodes if he so wanted to. Author's note, not a typo. Lionel returned to the location of his mother. She sat in a meeting with the remainder of the Luxniks, or maybe what the Luxniks would become. They seemed to be in the middle of a war against an existence they couldn't even quite name. But Lionel appeared out of nowhere, causing the Luxniks to suddenly stand violently, ready to fight. Stop. This is the man who defeated the creature. You should be thanking him, Eleanor said with a powerful voice. The Luxniks were astonished and then froze in place. Lionel looked around, still not quite understanding what was going on. It's time to return home, Mom? Eleanor's gaze flickered, and the expressions of the Luxniks changed. When had their matriarch had a child? And when had he grown so large? And so powerful at that? In the end, Eleanor nodded slowly. She had only continued this farce because she thought it would still be important to the zone. But since it wasn't, that would be fine. Come with me, Eleanor said to Lionel. Though they would be leaving, there were still certain things she wanted to show Lionel first. Halt. A man stood with a furious gaze. He was practically spewing hot fire. This was his wife they were talking about. How dare bang. Lionel's fist was like a tide of smoldering heat. Chapter 2252. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 25 seconds AM. Chapter 2252. Violet wins if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Chapter 2252. Violet wins. Lionel could guess what the problem was. He just didn't have the time to care about it, or coddle this man's feelings. Just because there was no vital star force innate node in this time, didn't mean there wasn't one in his time. And he wanted to find out before he decided what his next step would be. Every second someone delayed him, was another second that Aina would spend dead. This person was lucky that they were a member of the Luxniks family, or else he would have just directly killed him. Though he knew that time didn't work linearly, he still didn't want to risk what might happen if the wrong person died. But his message was clear and obvious. Eleanor looked at this scene with a complicated expression, but didn't say anything. She knew that her son wasn't in the best of moods, and though she didn't know what he had gone to do in the last few days, she knew that it was definitely related to Aina. Be kinder to them, they don't understand, Eleanor said after some hesitation. I think they understand more than they've told you outright, Lionel responded. Or more accurately, they haven't repeated it before you in these last few days. But the Luxniks family here isn't the same as the ones we know from our timeline. The man coughed up a mouthful of blood, his situation quite haggard. If not for the fact he suddenly felt a rising heat charging through his nodal pathways, he would have already tried to get up and charge forward. However, he realized that if he was any more reckless, he would burn to ash from the inside out. Eleanor's gaze flickered, but she didn't say anything. After a moment, she turned and began to lead Lionel away. She knew that his words were correct too, but it was difficult to just outright ask questions that she already knew the answer to. It would cause suspicion and make her task more difficult. But that didn't mean that she hadn't done her own research. And that was precisely what she was leading Lionel into. I'm not sure what was going on here, but there was a powerful beast located in this region that was overseeing a great deal of things. For whatever reason though, it never took action personally to wipe the rest of us out as though it was wary of something. But this. Eleanor stepped out from the underground passageway and into a room of lightly glowing violet. Lionel's gaze sharpened. As far as the eye could see, there were countless tubes filled with a thick, pale violet liquid. It was far more like a gel than anything else, and it was sturdy enough that it held the humans inside them in place. This violet liquid, he recognized it. He had definitely felt it from Richard. Novi/LB. 1N in the last several years, these 3 planets have been like a farm. That's the best word that I can use to describe it. 90% of it were factories just like this one, while the remaining 10% were lands more like the ones we're just in, and the latter was ruled by our Luxnix family. In reality, we were more like farmers having children, raising them, only to have the majority of them chosen for this sick science experiment. I felt the weight of this force before from that Richard boy. I know I told you that you might be interested in it, but now I'm quite happy that you didn't pay attention to my silly words. I don't know what this force is, but it is incredibly dangerous. It's quite clear to me that they don't even trust themselves with this power, which is why they've instead chosen to experiment on us, though I don't know why. Lionel knew exactly why. The human race was the very same race that succeeded in accepting the powers of the god-beast. Who knew what other kind of potential they might have lying dormant? This violet force, it felt powerful, extremely so. But it was also something that he felt no one person could possibly control because the words came to him like a tide. Because they broke the fundamental laws of reality. In these few days he had only split his attention away from improving his vital star force for a single reason, and that was to talk to one of his prisoners. Richard. In that time he found out exactly what the ability of violet force was. It broke the laws of causality, the most fundamental rules of equivalent exchange. Whatever you gave, you always received more in return. If you punched with 100 pounds of force, you would explode with one with 200 pounds of power. If you ran at 10 kilometers an hour, you would find yourself at the end of that hour having run 15 kilometers instead. You could exchange years for more years, time for more time. It was fundamentally impossible in nature, no matter how strong you were, and definitely regardless of how weak you were. The violet winds rise north. Lionel felt his body quake and he suddenly violently bent over, his body shaking. He coughed, feeling something within him stir. "Fuck off," he said coldly. The stirring figure in the pool of crimson came to a stop, its connection to Lionel being violently ripped apart. Lionel stood to his full height as though nothing had happened. "Mom, I'll take these factories with us." Eleanor, who had just gone from worrying about Lionel to confused, couldn't say very much as Anastasia appeared and began to swallow up the factories as though nothing at all had happened. These were all failures, Lionel knew that. In fact, the fact Richard continued to live in the dimensional verse at all meant that the entire project was a meaningless failure, so much so that they had abandoned them altogether. However, Lionel still took them. As for what he wanted to do with them, maybe only he knew. Chapter 2253. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 23 seconds AM. Chapter 2253. Deserved. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2253. Deserved. There's something else I want to show you, Eleanor said after Lionel had finished. Eleanor led Lionel through the somewhat familiar catacombs again, but this time there was a barrier up ahead, one formed by the Luxnix family. It seemed that they had almost guessed that this was where Eleanor would go. Or rather, they had assumed that this would be the first location she brought Lionel, and had even begun doubting their own judgment until they finally appeared. Lionel moved, but Eleanor held his shoulder, stopping him. She didn't use a lot of force, but Lionel wouldn't just casually brush off his own mother's arm, at least she thought so. And luckily he didn't seem to be rage-fueled enough to do so. She lied lightly. Lionel was too smart to casually let something so detrimental to them slip. He probably only called her mom so that he would have someone to fight. It was uncharacteristic, but what it told Eleanor was that her son was still very much a child. Lionel might be 26, but it was hard to grow and mature when everything came so easy to you, and even more difficult when you had to fake much of your outward appearance. Eleanor knew exactly what that felt like. This wasn't just because she was a princess with a father like Emperor Fox, but it was also because she was extremely talented from a young age. It took her a long while and meeting Velasco to finally mature into the woman she was today. But even then she had had her mother. Velasco's method of raising Lionel had grown into a self-confident and perfect warrior. He could face the battlefield without a change to his expression, and even smile at that. He was a true Morales. Eleanor didn't hate what her husband had chosen to do. Velasco had likely known the kind of situation they were in and that very soon, they would have to face a world far larger than their own. However, it had still neglected Lionel as a person. Not entirely, of course. Because Velasco knew the type of person Lionel was, he was able to mold Lionel's character with just 2 words, respect and persistence. Another child wouldn't understand such an abstract thing, but Lionel had grown around those 2 words, slowly molding their definitions into his own understanding until he became a level-headed man who could see right from wrong. He still knew right from wrong. His mind was more than sharp enough to grasp it, he just didn't care right now. And that was what was missing. When logic couldn't lead Lionel to why he should care, then something else had to. Eleanor ignored everyone else and looked Lionel in the eyes, cupping both of his cheeks. The billowing black fog that came from the corner of his eyes singed her hands and burnt them slowly, but she didn't seem to notice, looking toward Lionel deeper and deeper as though she was trying to understand something. "Little lion, my father said something about you that I can't quite understand but I still believe to be true. He said you and your father are the 2 greatest men he's ever met. Do you want to prove the both of us wrong?" Lionel didn't say anything, looking at his mother. He would feel much better if he could just steamroll them all, he knew he would. He hadn't vented nearly enough against the Shadow Tail, it just wasn't as satisfying when it wasn't his own raw power, it wasn't as pleasing. Your father was a man who held this sort of rage within himself, but do you know what happened when he lost control over his own mind? He harmed Anastasia, a companion that had been by his side for countless years. The Void Palace, the deeper, hidden branches of the Morales family, the Three-Finger Cult, these were all existences that your father could have destroyed whenever he wanted. It would have been easy, just a snap of his fingers. Do you know why he didn't? Why he let them insult him behind his back? To show fear in his face, and yet scheme against his interests in the dark? Do you believe that your father was stupid, little lion? Lionel's fists clenched, the billowing trail of smoke becoming thicker and thicker. Eleanor's hands were practically black now, but she still didn't release Lionel's cheeks, her eyes looking at him with a slightly watery look. It's because they weren't worth his time, it's because he had a bigger, larger goal, it's because he was able to place down his temporary satisfaction for the sake of something larger than himself. He couldn't gain satisfaction from others, he could only find it within himself. There'll no doubt be many who speculate about your father's death, many ignorant people who don't understand what he truly faced and believe that he had simply overestimated himself. Did he ever spare a thought for those people? Did he even care to look at them? Lionel's fists were clenched so hard that they twitched despite his usual steady control, the space around them splintering beneath a roaring wave of destruction. Lionel took deep breaths, the winds and the surroundings growing agitated before he slowly calmed down. He had lost count of the number of people he had killed to vent his rage. He had once always kept track of the exact number, but it was lost to him now, dancing within a dense blob of memories beyond him and only accessible to his enlightened self. And it was possible that even he hadn't bothered to count. The number was easily in the trillions, an impossible number, vast and endless as the rivers of blood. And yet the rage was still there, it was still smoldering, it was still overflowing, boiling and rattling as though his body was a lid it was trying to pop off. He hadn't made those that had actually attacked his father pay, they were already dead at his hands. It had all been meaningless, a vast chasm of emptiness that only deepened with every death, many of whom had done nothing at all and were as innocent as could be. Did he feel bad? No, he really couldn't bring himself to, he didn't have the capacity anymore. Did he know it was wrong? That, at least he could admit. He closed his eyes and the smokiness ebbed into a slow stream once more. Did he want this wrath to disappear? No N-O. V/EL, B, 1, N, but he would direct it to where it was deserved. Chapter 2254. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 20 seconds AM. Chapter 2254. Key: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2254. Key: Eleanor smiled lightly, pinching Lionel's cheeks as though he was still a little boy. She hadn't gotten to do this and took pleasure in every second. Unfortunately, she didn't get to see Lionel's embarrassed expression. She was certain that a 26-year-old having his cheeks pinched by his mom like this might react with a blush, but Lionel only stared at her with certainty and stability. Inwardly, she couldn't help but laugh to herself. Confidence and self-assurance wasn't something that Lionel lacked. Half of her speech was probably useless. Her son didn't gain validation from others, but the problem was that he was walking down a path of cruelty that was almost impossible to turn back from, and she wasn't sure that she had helped him turn back. She could only hope that he would have more control over his emotions. At the very least, exposing their relationship so that he would have a reason to get into another fight was far beneath him, and he likely knew this as well. Eleanor released Lionel and the latter raised his hand. With a flash, his body changed, growing about half a foot. His eyes turned golden and his pupils became sharp, slit lines. His hair turned a furious and aggressive white gold color that shone like the sun, and his usually facial hair-free face gained just as aggressive sideburns. His canines lengthened and claws grew from his hands. His heart thumped like the growl of a wild beast, and the bloodlines of the Luxniks before him seemed to cool into an icy flow, their bodies freezing in place. No matter how hard they tried, they couldn't seem to muster up the courage to fight back. An OVLB. One, and Eleanor nodded slightly. Lionel had indeed had a non-violent method of dealing with these people. What was the snowy star owl lineage factor to the golden tiger lineage factor? Especially when one of his arms was coated with the god beast of creation. The two walked by, and the members of the Luxniks seemed to resign themselves to the situation. What else could they do? It was clear that this son of their matriarch was far beyond their understanding. When they had entered the temple, one that was once again extremely familiar to Lionel, his expression couldn't help but become serious, if it was even possible for his current self to become any more serious. In the position of where Lionel had first found the bronze tablet. It was still there. The difference was that there was a silver tablet present as well, and on top of that, a golden tablet. Confusion painted Lionel's thoughts. Why would this be here? And if it was here now, then why wasn't it here in the future? Logic would tell him that it was because he had taken it here and now, so how could it be here in the future? But then why didn't everything else work like that? He had just destroyed the world of dimensional cleanse, so how was it there for him to benefit from in the future? It was clear and obvious that time didn't work linearly, so something else must have taken it. But then what did that mean for the timeless event? Lionel's pupils constricted. Elryan had said that there should be a timeless event that occurred here, so where was it? Unless the shadow tail. Lionel's thoughts spun. The time around a timeless event should be stricter in flow than other points in time. It was easier to snip, loop and rearrange normal points in time, but a timeless event was fixed. What happened here would definitely reverberate into the future. It seemed that Lionel was very much correct to not kill that man with a single fist. Had he, depending on what relation he had to himself, he could have very well ended up ending his own life. Lionel didn't have the cold shiver of a reaction one might expect from such a revelation. If anything, it had only emboldened him because it only meant that he was correct once again. Something had told him to be cautious, and listening to his inner voice and his calculation abilities had never failed him. Then what does it mean if I took those that should have become the members of the Viola family? What would change? The moment Lionel had this thought, he immediately sat down where he was. Without a word, he entered an intense state of meditation. Eleanor wasn't to say something, but she held back. She had tried meditating on the golden tablet as well. She thought that with her talent it would be a simple thing to see what was on the other side. She had already formed the starry-tailed fox lineage factor long before anyone else in the Luxniks had. As she had expected, things flowed smoothly from one step to the next, and she formed the twinkling light bear lineage factor, and then soon succeeded in forming the golden tiger lineage factor, although it had taken her much more effort. But when she got to the golden tablet, she couldn't even sense what the creature hidden deep within was, let alone comprehending it. She even felt, for the first time in her life, even if she dedicated years to it, she would never succeed. What she didn't know, though, was that Lionel wasn't attempting to meditate on the golden tablet at all. With a single glance, he knew his current body didn't have what it took. It would be nothing more than a waste of time. If he had to guess what it would take, he would have to do one of three things. Either become a light and star sovereign, Raise his Scarlet Star Force innate node to at least the 8th dimension, probably nearer the pinnacle and close to the 9th, or comprehend both light and star force to the life state. He would reach that level one day, but that wasn't today. His goal was different. Chapter 2255. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 19 seconds AM. Chapter 2255. Good luck, Master. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2255. Good luck, Master. These were just guesses on his part, and it could very well take more than that. But what mattered most to him now were what changes would occur in the future. Half a day later, he opened his eyes with a confident light. Indeed, the changes that would occur in the future should have already occurred, otherwise the silver and golden tablets wouldn't have been missing already. But that wasn't why he had meditated for half a day. He had already concluded that in the first couple of minutes. Instead, he was confirming something else. He was certain he could use timeless events to change the future. This might be the key to reviving his father. If he played his cards correctly, he could most definitely change those events, of that he was certain. Whatever the rest of the details were, he didn't care. But he would need to be able to do one thing: he would have to be able to predict a timeless event before it happened. And if he couldn't, then he would have to trigger one himself. He was sure that he could do it because Ryan had made it quite clear what it took for one to appear. And that was any event that caused the Northern Star to come closer. These were the thoughts of a madman. Everyone wanted to avoid such events to the best of their abilities because it would mean that existence itself was one step closer to being destroyed, but Lionel didn't seem to spare a thought to this at all. Hadn't he just stopped a timeless event? Then the world owed him already. And even if it didn't, so what? In his mind, he would already sacrifice the world for the sake of Aina. He had already done it before. If it was for the sake of his father, he would sacrifice existence itself. Lionel looked up to find that his mother was still standing there, patient and unhurried. When she saw that Lionel opened his eyes without any change, she smiled understandingly. It's very difficult to comprehend, don't be too hard on yourself. From what I can tell, you need something beyond just light and star affinity to succeed. You need an in-depth comprehension of the two that exist beyond this realm. I don't believe that even those outside worlds would find it easy. There were definitely many life and star experts out there, Lionel was sure. But they lacked the flexibility of the human body. It was this in conjunction with proper affinity and force manipulation that could allow them to touch upon that power. It was still beyond the current Alienor, but Lionel was confident that she would reach that level soon enough. As for him, he felt that it was guaranteed. Lionel didn't correct his mother about what he was meditating about, it was true anyway. He did, indeed, have no ability to claim the highest level of his lineage factor just yet. With a wave of his hand, the silver and golden tablets were taken with him. Is that everything? He asked. Yes, we can go now, Alienor confirmed. Lionel led his mom into the segmented cube. He looked around, trying to see if he could spot anything. In an unknown number of years, Y-Star Order would come here and then bind himself to the bronze tablet. He had already checked the tablet, but there was definitely no sign of Y-Star Order, and he had long since vanished from the segmented cube, even taking Vice and Candle with him. It was almost amusing how he hadn't used the two in order to save them as a trump card, but now he would never be able to. He didn't find himself caring much. Y-Star Order had at least never hurt anyone around him. Though whether that was because Lionel was ignorant to when he had tried or not, that was a matter that only time would tell, along with what goals Y-Star Order truly had. When he truly couldn't find anything, Lionel turned and left, stepping into the segmented cube and streaking toward Earth. Not long after he had done so, the matriarch's husband stepped into the temple. Looking around and seeing that they had left, he surprisingly sighed a breath of relief, stretching out his back while leaning backward and pressing against his hips. Damn, and getting too old for this. You're young right now though. Fuck you, damn brat. You have the time to contact me from the future now, but what about the last 3 years? Were you too busy on vacation? Too busy fucking everything with 2 legs and a pair of breasts? I resent that. I don't have long to live, you know. I thought you'd be nicer to me. Bah, you're not getting any sympathy from me and my old bones. How many times have I experienced death because of you? Now you fear it? Where's your humanity? Fear it? The voice laughed boisterously. I fear nothing. Easy to say that when you know some part of you will live on, but am glad you finally made this choice. I told you when I met you that it was a fruitless endeavor, and you just refused to listen. Instead, you've put me, not to mention that poor girl, through hardship again and again. She won't remember it. But I will. And there you go again using logic over everything. What happened to humanity? Have I taught you nothing? The voice chuckled. You've taught me plenty, old man. Humanity isn't on the list, though. Have some respect, Dash. Need I list off some of your greatest hits? The list is quite long. Let's see. Yes, here there's stealing that emperor's wife, and then there was the time you pissed over that city wall. Oh right, there's also the time that woman pissed you off so much that you rap. Enough. You describing those things so simply makes it seem like I wasn't in the right. You should have more respect for your master. In fact, you should actually call me that for once. Oh, would you look at that? Your 1327th death is on the way. Good lucks. The matriarch's husband practically pulled at his hair. Talking to this brat was truly infuriating. NOVLB. One end from the skies above, a shadow suddenly appeared from a gaping, spinning black hole. A second shadow tail had appeared. It seemed that changing timeless events wasn't so simple after all. Good luck, Master. Chapter 2256. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 15 seconds AM. Chapter 2256. Godchild, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2256. Godchild, the matriarch's husband stepped out into the air, facing the monster in the skies. His hands were clasped behind his back without even the slightest intent on defending himself. Was there a point? His death was inevitable. No one could ever tell what the trigger of a timeless event was. It was also impossible to tell just how many people would be allowed to die, or how many you could save before the backlash of the timeless event made the event far worse. Many had tried to fight against timeless events before. The strongest of them sent armies of entire worlds at these timeless events, losing an uncountable number of experts all in a vain attempt. What was clear through all of these attempts was one thing. N/0 nit was hopeless. The more you fought against a timeless event, the worse it became, the more bloody, the more violent. The best way to deal with a timeless event was to slow it down and minimize risk, hopefully finding out what the center point of it all was and allowing just that event alone to happen. While doing this wouldn't change the fact the Northern Star would most definitely come closer, it would still help those related to the event feel somewhat better. Rarely, though, did a timeless event necessitate the death of just a small number of people. Usually it required at least several hundred, each one changing the course of history in their own way and causing a tsunami tide of changes in the far-off future. Even rarer was it that a timeless event necessitated the death of just a single individual, but this was exactly such an event. And this single individual who had to die was none other than the matriarch's husband, or more accurately, Y Star Order. He didn't go by any other name, or maybe he had just lived for so long that he had forgotten what his original name was. He might have asked these people what his name had been the first few times he was revived at the whims of that terrible disciple of his, but he couldn't be bothered to any longer. He no longer had the patience for it. Plus, he preferred Y Star Order. He was indeed very wise and very handsome at that, though that had nothing to do with his name. Y Star Order suited him, it also suited his duty. He had long since become indifferent to these deaths. You could become numb to anything if you experienced it enough. But this time he had a wide smile on his face. That disciple of his had finally gotten his act together. It was a beautiful day indeed. A beautiful day to die. To others, death was the end. But in reality, to Y Star Order, his death on this day all those years ago? Or actually, today, yes indeed it was today. How had he forgotten that? That brute was descending from the skies, he couldn't forget that. Regardless, death for him was just the beginning. To the people of this world, savants were extraordinary, they were talents that needed to be hoarded away and saved. But they were deeply flawed, and they obviously weren't so extraordinary if they could be so easily captured in the first place. To the wider world, the whole of existence out there, savants were defects, poor imitations of the real thing, poor imitations of existences born to be gods. Y Star Order raised his hands and laughed toward the skies as the shadow tail descended. Come here, you big brute. In the future, I'll slaughter you kind like children, I'll bathe the seas in your blood and I'll die T-bang. Y Star Order was hit out of the skies, crashing through the entire planet. His body only seemed to hold its shape for a small moment on the other side before it burst into a rain of blood, leaving behind nothing but a small transparent ball. His ethereal glabella. Son of a bitch, that bastard never lets me finish my speech. Y Star Order drifted like a speeding bullet through the endless depths of space. It wouldn't be until a long while later he finally came to a stop on a planet with force so that he could finally be reborn and become the god that he was always meant to. The so-called spark of the dimensional verse was another bastardization of a concept that existed in wider existence. It could even be said that it was only half of the puzzle, the existence of savants being the other half. There was only one problem. In order to touch onto all of this strength, you had to die first. No one knew why this was. Some speculated that it was because you had to come into contact with the first dimension in order to display your full strength. Others said that the body could only stimulate its greatest potential when it had been pushed over its limits. Others said that this was simply a reflection of the ultimate force manipulation, a state where you were able to reach enlightenment of the complete opposite of your path. What could be the opposite of an untimely death if not a life far more bright and blazing than others? It was unknown if anyone would ever find out. But there was one thing that was known for absolute certainty. For every death and revival of a god-child, existence would grow one step closer to a forever death. Without fail, every new god-child meant the existence of a new timeless event. By now, things might very well be becoming clear to many. Cynthia Oman died and was revived, forming a timeless event. The good news was that Velasco Morales' death had occurred several days afterward, and there was hope that it would be considered a different event. The bad news was that Velasco Morales had a great number of ties to Cynthia Oman, and the hatred Cynthia Oman held for Velasco was maybe one of the few things that actually drove her. Ana's mother couldn't be revived even by Anastasia due to their connection. Compared to the seventh dimension, the birth of a godchild was so impossibly beyond that it was impossible to put into words. Anastasia, the world spirit of a complete world, could not revive Ana's mother because this fallen woman's daughter had entered the seventh dimension. Cynthia Oman was a godchild. Even those with faint connections to her would be out of Anastasia's reach. And as for Velasco, even existence itself wouldn't be able to bring him back as it inched toward destruction. Chapter 2257, published at 23rd of October 2023 7:10 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 2257. Farewell. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. In a location separate from time and space, a man sat. His face was hard to see, but it didn't seem to be because he made any attempt to hide it. It was rather that the dream force radiating from him was too strong. It made him look more like a dense mass of potential rather than what he truly was. A man that had reached the limit of all things. Sometimes he too forgot who he was, not that it mattered much to him. He had reached the pinnacle of the world, but he had lost everything along the way. His father, his mother, the love of his life, his brothers. One by one they left him, all so that he could sit here at the end of existence itself. This was the only location in the world that remained whole. While he was thinking about his family, everything else had already crumbled. There was no more concept of family, no more concept of personhood or life even. He should probably be dead too, but he was strong enough to resist things that others could not. It was quite amusing actually. It was only because he was here that the world couldn't be erased and start anew. Not until all things faded away, until there was nothing left to destroy, until destruction itself reached its very limits, could creation bloom once again. His home of Earth had called it the Big Bang. He had heard it called several things throughout his life. He had too many different names for things floating around his mind. He hoped to actually forget some of them, not that his mind would allow it. An infallible memory was probably the wish of many. None of them thought about what kind of curse it was, though. He envied that master of his. He had experienced so many years of life that he had even forgotten his own name. Ah, to forget, what a wonderful thing. The faceless man waved a hand, a bottle appearing. The world around him trembled with rage and squeezed down, but he ignored it as though existence itself was just a child throwing a tantrum. It didn't like the fact things were still being created. Just this bottle of liquor had cost him half his remaining strength to conjure. He took a swig of the strongest alcohol left, staring into the northern star ahead. He had never liked alcohol very much. He avoided it. He liked having perfect control of himself at all times. The idea of a substance that could alter his perfect thought filled him with disgust. He hated it. And yet here he was, allowing it as part of his final meal. Disgusting, he muttered. Can never tell why men like this so much. I much prefer those fruity drinks. He waved his hand again and pina colada appeared in place of the bottle of hard liquor. This time, existence didn't protest, probably because he had changed what he had already created instead of creating more. It was a nice little loophole. Compared to the first that had taken half of what he had, This time it wasn't even a drop in the ocean. His deep well of force was so vast that he could probably consume this northern star before him. Not that he cared to. What would be the point? Was there something beyond this star? They say that it represented existence, but what did that even mean? The human consciousness was so frail, it couldn't fathom something like this, and even now, having shed all that weakness, it overloaded his mind to think about it, maybe because he knew the answer. He was the only one with the strength to go beyond this northern star, to see what was behind it. He had given everything he had to see his loved ones again, twisted fate and time in all kinds of ways. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, if there was something beyond this world, something stronger, something beyond even himself, he could finally do it. He just wanted that chance. He was certain that even if he popped into a world where even he was somehow the weakest ant of the hill, he could climb to the top once again, then he might be able to finally see those faces again, those smiles. He took a sip of his pina colada. "Delicious," he said with a smile, taking another sip. A hand reached up to his face, pushing up what seemed to be a pair of glasses. Who knew why a man of his stature needed such a thing? It didn't seem to make much sense, but he didn't care to remove them. These glasses and himself were the only things that had made it to the end of all things. "You're a funny joke, you know that?" He laughed, raising his glass to the northern star. "Did I reach the top of the world? Or was that always you?" There was no response. Of course there was no response. The northern star wasn't a person, it had no will, no intelligence. And beyond it, there was absolutely nothing. He remembered how he had felt the first time he learned that vast emptiness in his chest, as though existence was telling him that there was nothing more to chase, and he had already left behind everything that would have made this painful life of his worthwhile. But worse than that, it was frustration of not understanding, frustration of an unanswered question, frustration of a logical inconsistency. And, 0v1n, how had existence come to be? How could there be nothing beyond? How could something come from nothing? What caused this repetitive cycle of life and death, of creation and destruction? Why did they exist? It was so frustrating that he laughed, drinking the last of his drink. He could keep existing into perpetuity, looking into this star and staring down the existence that even the gods could do nothing again. Well, he couldn't do anything about it. But it couldn't do anything to him either. But he was tired. Sitting in this very spot, he had tried everything, poured out every potential solution the strongest mind in existence could think of, and it had all never mattered. He was still alone. He tipped the glass one final time and threw it into the air. It didn't last even a second before it was destroyed. "You win. I, Lionel Morales, accept my loss. Farewell." There was no fanfare. In one moment, there was a single kernel of life remaining. In the next, there was nothing. Chapter 2258. Published at 23rd of October 2023, 7:09 and 55 seconds AM. Chapter 2258. Youth, if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel froze, a discomfort coming from his chest. For some reason he felt both a lot lighter, a slight hint annoyed, and a huge amount confused. When he checked his surroundings, his pupils constricted and his breath caught in his throat. What just happened? At the speed the segmented cube was moving, they would reach Earth in less than an hour. Anastasia could push it even faster, but that would require personal energy use that extended beyond the force she was pulling from the surroundings, so it wasn't a worthwhile expense. But that wasn't really the point. Because they were moving at such speed, even the slightest deviation could throw them way off course in just a few split moments. He could have allowed Anastasia to pilot things herself, but because he wanted to take his mind off of something, he chose to control the segmented cube himself. 3:29 seconds. There was a gap in his memory of exactly that long, as though he had been reset and rebooted, and no matter how hard he thought, he couldn't understand what had happened. He had only experienced this 2 other times, 3 if he counted his first interaction with Dreamforce, while the other 2 times were the only times he had entered that enlightened state. But he was certain that it wasn't that this time unless that demoness could. If she could remotely stop him from transforming, could she force him to transform? But for what purpose? He was still in perfect control of himself in both states, there was no purpose other than to spite him. His jaw set. That wasn't beyond that woman in the slightest. Slighting him out of pure spite? It seemed that she might gain a great amount of satisfaction out of doing that. Lionel took a breath and calmed himself. Surprisingly, it happened much faster this time than it had before. He felt more in control of his state of mind, he felt a lot more like himself all of a sudden. He felt that he could shut off the valve of that emotion again just like he had when Aina left him. It was so easy suddenly. No-V. E. L. B. I. And instead of doing so though he stopped, falling into a deep silence. He never acknowledged it because he didn't want to. That future version of himself, he chose to see it as just one possibility of many, a possibility that he would surpass. But now feeling the difference in his control over himself, he felt that he had disappeared. It seemed that he had falsely accused the demoness. Was that why he had lost those few seconds? He had heard of the future affecting the past, but was it supposed to be so exaggerated? He had even thought once that this was simply a quirk, or rather a flaw, of incomplete worlds like this one. He didn't think it would be such a prominent thing in the real world. Lionel sat in silence, closing his eyes after a while and allowing the segmented cube to drift. There was too much he didn't understand. Why did his future self's influence suddenly disappear? And did it actually disappear? Or was it just that deep well of despair that had? He had a feeling that it was just the latter. But that only made it more odd. Why had the despair vanished? Lionel wanted to believe that it was because his future self had finally succeeded, but he felt like that wasn't the answer either. What was there to despair about if you had already given up everything? There was no despair because there was only apathy left. No. Something deeper than apathy. Nothingness. Lionel opened his eyes, a blazing light within. His future self had failed? He didn't care. As far as he was concerned, that wasn't him at all. Lionel's fists gripped the controls before him tightly, suddenly flooring the segmented cube and zipping through the skies. The smoldering smoke coming from his eyes and the bottoms of his feet ebbed again and again until they vanished entirely, a wild grin spreading across his face. He was eager to get home. He would have Anastasia check one more time, and if there were no innate nodes, then he would break free of this simulation. There was no doubt that he would find someone with the innate node he needed in wider existence. Once he saved Aina, he could turn his attention to his father again. A timeless event was all he needed, just one timeless event. Lionel's eyes carried the brightness of youth, a brightness that wasn't worn and torn by the vicissitudes of life. He had the fire and drive of a young man. He felt that everything could be in the palm of his hand so long as he worked hard enough. He would see his queen again. He would see his father again. He would see his family whole again. He raised his head to the skies and roared, having the joy ride of his life. An unknown number of years later, a certain ethereal glabella finally crashed and landed into a barren planet. It was so small that one might assume that it was a moon instead, but it had just enough force for the dim ethereal glabella to finally flash. Very quickly, all the force of this small planet surged toward this small crystal. It was said that all godchilds had their own trials to face in order to successfully awaken. Regardless of what it was, death would always be observed in some form. 4Y Star Order, his fate was to drift through the endless depths of space, weathering countless years of torment. The first time he experienced this, it had nearly broken him. But now he found it to be an interesting journey. It was as though he had lived hundreds of lives, each one just slightly different from the last. At first he blamed that disciple of his. Due to the nature of his power, he had grown too enlightened to not experience others toying with his timeline. So, every time Lionel tried a new method to save his father, he had to experience this death again. Chapter 2259. Published at 23rd of October 2023 7:09 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 2259. Lab setting. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Naked, but happy, Wise Star Order stretched himself out, feeling exuberant. He got to experience life again, that much was a small bit of happiness. But then he sighed, remembering how much work he had to do. That brat surpassed me again, I really have to figure out how he does it. Something's not right with that little monster. He had experienced over 1,300 lifetimes due to this quirk of time and his status as a godchild. It was an oddity in the timeline that was caused for reasons that he still wasn't completely certain of. He was sure that disciple of his had an explanation, but what kind of master asked their disciple for pointers? He would rather die. Again. Every time he was revived, he would find new insights, and he would tweak his progression path just a little bit to increase the efficiency. But there was only so much he could do, honestly. He was already in the 8th dimension in this body, so to say that his foundation had already been laid was a huge understatement. But there were obviously ways to overcome this. If not, Lionel wouldn't have been able to become so strong either. And he who had taught and raised that brat a bit, obviously knew his fair share as well. He just had to do it all again. Plus, between now and when he would meet Lionel next, thousands of years would pass, and that was just in this incomplete world. The true first time he met Lionel, the time that occurred before Lionel's first attempt to save his father, happened even longer after that, and it didn't occur in this incomplete world at all. He laughed to himself. He was looking forward to it. Beating down that arrogant little boy was one of the many guilty pleasures he would get to enjoy in this lifetime again. But this time, I won't let you surpass me so easily, wise Star Order thought to himself, a flash blazing in his eyes. He had been carefully preparing himself for this lifetime. There were certain things that those at the very top couldn't see, but those pitiful people at the bottom could see clearly. Of course, if his enemies heard him describing himself in such a way, they'd have him stripped naked, hung upside down and whipped, and his beautiful, pert bottom would be swollen red. Wise Star Order subconsciously grabbed his own butt, shuddering. I should get to work. He'll need to be strong enough to stop that brat from destroying the world. Years from now, Lionel would most definitely try to trigger that timeless event, and he wouldn't care about the casualties at all. In fact, that was also the first time he met Lionel on the original Timeless. There were some burdens that an elder would have to alleviate from his juniors, and he was determined to take this one on. He shook his head. Where did that brat find an infinity beast, though? My work is cut out for me. With that thought, Wise Star Order put his hands on his hips. It was time he got out of there. As for why he had chosen to change so much about the Luxnix family's true history, maybe only he and that annoying disciple of his knew. The segmented cube shuttle appeared above Earth, and Lionel stepped out. Down below, the Pluto race was still building the pyramids, and up above, the corpse vessel of the Void Beast was still floating aimlessly, the Void race members that had stayed behind waiting for judgment to be cast on them. Lionel looked toward the Void Beast's corpse and took a leap forward, landing on it. The Void race reacted to this quite violently, but remembering how Lionel had been with Elryan, they hesitated. One part wanted to shred this human apart, and another part wanted to appease the Pluto. The two sides of themselves crippled their own movement entirely. Anastasia. The little floating spirit appeared, a hint of surprise. Lionel's voice sounded brighter. You know, you never really explained to me how you work. The fact you're a world spirit makes sense to me, somewhat. But the lab setting and abode setting? Not to mention that odd vessel? What does that have to do with what you are? Anastasia fell into silence for a long time, and then just chose to explain things simply. I'm the world spirit of a complete world that was destroyed by the god beasts of destruction. I should have fallen with my world, but I was saved by the Minerva race. Minerva race. They're similar to the Pluto race, but they were destroyed a long time ago. Anastasia fell into another silence before she continued. They crafted me into this vessel, and the hope was to help their race live, but I wasn't enough and ended up being crippled. I've passed through many hands, dormant, until I was lost and forgotten, eventually falling to this world. Falling, huh? Lionel said. What's that supposed to mean? I don't know, just sounds suspicious. A treasure like you dash. I'm not a treasure. Yes, okay, a beauty like you dash. Much better? Wouldn't just casually fall to a world like this one. Feels like a scheme. What a stupid scheme, do you not see how valuable I am? Lionel chuckled. That explained his question. The lab setting and abode settings were just add-ons. The main function was probably to turn the power of a complete world toward crafting. In that case, there was a workbench within Anastasia, one of the most valuable tools at a crafter's disposal outside of their world spirit, but he had never realized that. Anastasia herself was probably one of the greatest workbenches in all of existence. I haven't paid nearly enough attention to all the special quirks of the lab setting, especially after your evolutions. What do you have in there that can dissect a corpse? N. 0 Velbin. Lionel grinned ear to ear. Chapter 2260? Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 17 seconds AM. Chapter 2260. Easy. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Anastasia's brows shot up, then she looked toward the void beast below. Processing materials and alleviating the more troublesome aspects of force crafting like gathering materials, refining them, preparing them, were all matters that the lab setting was created for. But on top of that, it was also a force multiplier. It allowed for experiments on large levels, and without even Lionel's input, she had already integrated all of the test subjects of the Violet Force experiments, it was something that came second nature to her. Processing a beast, even if it was a void beast, was well within her power. After all, this void beast had long since died and its vitality had been crushed to a point even these lessers of the void race could stand within it just fine. As a complete world spirit, it was well within Anastasia's prowess. The reason she was a bit shocked was because this wasn't what she had expected Lionel to do. Didn't he plan on passing this down to little Blackstar? Why did he change his mind? Anastasia shook her head hard. What was she thinking? This was a huge problem just thinking about this matter. Lionel was already marked by the god races. Stealing their ship was tempting fate. They obviously feared the Pluto, not Lionel. Also, it was impossible that they wouldn't fight back against this attempt. They already seemed as though they were ready to fight it out with Lionel to the death, just overhearing this conversation. These might be servants of the void race, but many of them were actually stronger than Shanrei and El Ryan. After all, those two were exceptionally young while they had already matured. They were on an unfathomable level in comparison to a human. Of course, that also meant that if they used their strength the regulator would react, and unlike their entity, they wouldn't be able to escape it so easily. In fact, it could be said the only thing protecting them from such a fate was the void beast ship itself, which did wonders for masking presences. Everything about Lionel's intentions sounded wild and ridiculous. But by this point Anastasia was used to it. She mostly wanted to know why Lionel didn't want to help little Blackstar out. I would expect a mighty world spirit like yourself to already understand, Lionel said, reading Anastasia's thoughts. Don't you like doing reckless things? Why would I care to consider that stuff? Anastasia huffed. Lionel chuckled, finding it all amusing. Assimilate allowed him to take the strength of an external item and pass it into a living being, whether that be himself, another, or his soul constructs. Breathe allowed him to give life and permanence to an object. That could be done through giving it a soul he commanded, or it could be done by allowing it to integrate with a living being after the use of assimilate. The problem then wasn't the powers themselves but rather the limitations. When he used assimilate on himself, the cost of Dream Force was higher than when he used it on his soul constructs, and it was even higher when he used it on a living being other than himself. This had been fixed with little Tali because of Anastasia's help he obviously had access to. But then came the second limitation, what one could handle, or more accurately what their foundation could in this case. Little Tali had been in a state of hyper-evolution, preparing to set its foundation by fully integrating itself into the sixth dimension. It couldn't have been a more perfect time to integrate with such a beast, and it gave the little guy a world of benefit. As for little Blackstar, he had already entered the seventh dimension and he was already well into his own path. Although he had integrated with a large portion of void beast blood, from what Lionel could tell here, that blood had not only been greatly diluted, but it was a drop in the ocean compared to the true amount of blood this creature had flowing through its veins. If he were to use assimilate and breathe on little Blackstar now, while it might still work, he would lose much more to breathe than he would have had he been just entering the sixth dimension or just deciding on his path. No, Lionel had something different planned. He knew that his king's might lineage factor wasn't infallible and it had its weaknesses. If he wanted to maximize this void beast corpse, he had to take it slow and give little Blackstar the chance to slowly change his fate on his own. The little guy had already fallen well behind Lionel, and for a beast that had once almost killed him on their first meeting, he knew that little Blackstar was very much not satisfied with just this. At the same time, the approach may also aid him in helping much more than just little Blackstar as well. Who knew what kind of treasures were hidden within a void beast's body? Of course, the void race probably took out all of the most valuable things before turning it into a ship, but he was already prepared for that reality. A little guy like him was just perfect for the scraps. Lionel grinned again and Anastasia rolled her eyes. What was this guy thinking about now? Then how are you going to take it, then? Cheeky brat. Lionel laughed. Oh, Elrian. Lionel's voice came out in a roar that sounded like something matched between a dragon's roar and claps of thunder. It boomed so loudly that his throat shredded to pieces, but on the surface he acted as though nothing at all had happened. The infuriated void race members froze and began to shake in fear. The Pluto race members below froze as well, but they looked up in astonishment rather than fear. A human could speak their language? Lionel strolled in and kicked the void race members out one by one. They didn't even dare to resist. They suddenly feared sliding Lionel. See? Easy. Novi, LB, 1N. Chapter 2261. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 15 seconds AM Chapter 2261. A name. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Anastasia watched everything, speechless. She didn't know what to say. That language had frozen even her for a moment. It held the weight of command and an undeniable majesty. Coming from Lionel, even without his king's might lineage factor activated, it felt as though the shadow of a true king had appeared, albeit it for just a moment. But after a moment, seeing the sneaky smile on Lionel's face, she couldn't help but ask, "You? What did you say?" "Well, that?" Lionel grinned. "I said that little boy's name." Anastasia froze. You said a name?" "Well, yeah. I can't actually speak that language, and if I copied anything else they said, wouldn't it be embarrassing if I said a word like, and, or, they'd laugh me out of the ship. Plus, I assumed that whatever his parents named him meant something bold and powerful." It was impossible for even Lionel to learn an entire language just based off of a short conversation. But, picking out a repeatable series of sounds within that conversation was all too obvious. When Elryan was leaving, they had all saluted him with that sound plus a prefix that he assumed meant something like young master, or young ruler. By process of elimination, picking out Elryan's name was as easy as breathing. "You are unbelievable," Anastasia muttered. "I know, right?" In pretty jury dash, Anastasia slapped the back of his head. "Not in that way." The void race servants who had been kicked off of the ship quickly felt the suppression of the world around them. They quickly took out several items to fight back against the suppression, and unlike the individuals who had come down from the four great families, the black chains didn't appear around them. Clearly, whatever items they had taken out to protect themselves were far beyond what the four great families had had. They looked around in fear, but seeing that no one came for them, they took out other treasures and began to escape quickly one after another. Lionel rubbed the back of his head. "I don't know how a race like that can be so cowardly. I don't know what you're so angry about. When have I ever been wrong?" "Would you like me to list them one by one? In alphabetical or chronological order?" Lionel was stunned. This was very much not the response he had expected. But, just as quickly, his one mind began to subconsciously form the list and he had to shake his head to get it to stop. By then he was already one longer than he cared to admit. "Never mind." After a while, Anastasia burst out with laughter. She laughed so hard that twinkling crystals of blue came from her eyes. She felt like she was even dying of laughter. A name. They had been scared off by a name. It was cracking her up. The funniest part was that they probably had no idea. She knew a little bit about the Pluto race, mostly due to the Minerva race, and she knew that their language wasn't understood by many outside of their races, and definitely couldn't be spoken by anyone so casually. They had probably run because they thought they had mistaken Lionel's identity. After all, Lionel had been expelled from Elryan's body. Who knew if he was closer to the Pluto race than he seemed? Just imagining someone screaming Lionel in English and then scaring off a race of gods was killing her. Lionel smiled. "When you're done, we should probably get going in case one of them realizes they've been duped." Anastasia wiped her tears, though they had already long since floated away. V/E/L-/B/I/N. This was a nice idea by you and all, but moving this corpse in isn't exactly easy either, you know. It won't be as difficult as the hourglass because the difficulty is set and won't just infinitely increase, but it's beyond the current you for sure. Isn't that why I asked you if you could process it first? Lionel smiled. Anastasia looked down with a hint of hesitation. Could she? Maybe if she had a few months, probably a few years actually. That's okay, my favorite water boy is finally here. Lionel perked up. Elryan rushed in from the distance. He was still quite heavily injured and he hadn't fully recovered, but when he heard his name called, he rushed forward with all the speed his could muster. Plutos were the god of gods. So long as their name was spoken in its truest form, no matter the distance, they would hear it. But what Elryan didn't expect was that the person who called out would actually be Lionel? Hey, you're finally here, good. Do me a favor, use that little hourglass thingy to help Anastasia put this corpse inside. Elryan froze and his lip twitched. Hourglass thingy? He had only just learned this language recently, but he was pretty sure Lionel was being absolutely ridiculous again. Y-star order streaked across the skies with great speed. This timeline was already long after Lionel would have left this zone, but it had taken him quite a long time to finally revive. It was unknown whether all godchilds would definitely revive, but it was also obvious why. Those that were dead couldn't exactly tell tales, now could they? But why Star Order theorized that so long as a godchild died with an intact ethereal glabella, and around enough force, they would most definitely come back. Every time he died and Lionel did something dangerous, it was becoming more and more difficult to make sure his ethereal glabella remained protected. But this was a master's duty to his disciple. Ah, finally back. Why Star Order looked down toward the devastation of planet Luxnix, Viola and Montex. He remembered how heart-wrenching it had been the first time he saw it, but now he was simply numb. On the bright side, his wife survived in this timeline. On the unfortunate side, how would he sleep around now? He descended, his mind swirling with thoughts. Chapter 2262. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 12 seconds AM. Chapter 2262. Put me down. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Why Star Order chuckled to himself. He didn't know why he was thinking about that woman. Which life was it that he learned how she betrayed him? He was a Y Star Order and that sounded great. But compared to a Northern Star Order, it was worth next to nothing. The reality was that the truth of namesakes of the Luxnix family was much deeper than others knew, and it was something that Y Star Order had allowed to be buried. Y Star Orders were the bookkeepers and zookeepers of the god-beasts of creation. It was their job to document all of the races, worlds and natural phenomena of existence, not to mention taking care of all species. There was a time where the god-beasts of creation had at least one pairing of every plant and animal to ever exist. Of course, that catalog had long since been destroyed, but the ultimate purpose of Y Star Orders was their mental capacity to remember a lot of things. That was all. So, one could imagine why it was Y Star Order's wife who was the matriarch and de facto leader of the family, and not himself. Northern Star Orders were the true warriors. They were existences that, so long as they came into contact with an adequate well of light and star force, would be guaranteed to touch upon the golden tablet and claim the truest lineage factor of the infinity beasts. Of course, in this incomplete world, you would be more likely to enter the ninth dimension without the regulator striking you down than you would be to find a strong enough well of force. Even in complete worlds they were nigh unheard of, mostly destroyed by the god-beasts of creation. Not that Y Star Order would ever allow a Northern Star Order to take such a step even if they had such a thing available. That would be nothing short of suicide. If the other races knew that humans still had this capability, the small quarter that they had been given to continue to live as a race would be crushed. It could be said that this was the most foolish thing a human could do in this day and age. And then there was Snow Star Order. This was actually the fault of the English language. The translation wasn't nearly bold or sharp enough. Snow referred now to one of ice water, but rather one of soot and ash. Snow Star Orders were the executioners and messengers of the infinity beasts, and they were meant to remain as snowy star owls. Compared to other humans, they could exhibit much more of the snowy star owl's real strength, and they too could cross a galaxy with a single flap of their wings. Unfortunately, none of the techniques that Y Star Order had left behind had allowed the Snow Star Order of Lionel's time to display any of that power, which led to her dying at the hand of Velasco. Then again, Y Star Order thought to himself, knowing that man, he probably had enough strength to deal with the situation regardless. It was a shame that such a monster was born in this incomplete world. Of course he too was born here. But unlike Velasco, his Luxnix family didn't originate in this world, and he also knew how to get out. And with the project abandoned and the Shadow Tales gone, he could leave with his own methods whenever he wanted. But first, he had a treasure vault to leave behind in the spiritual's domain. Was it smart to give this kind of strength to the very disciple he would have to kick the ass of in a few millennia? No, definitely was not. But he would do it anyway because this was how the first timeline had gone. And and originally, he had left that treasure vault behind in the spiritual's domain out of sentiment. He knew what was coming and he had a fondness for the human race. Plus, he was leaving behind some of his Luxnix family, so he hoped that they would be able to benefit from his teachings. As for why he had left it in the spiritual's domain and not the human domain, it was a test. If the people of this incomplete world wanted any chance of crossing the coming trial, they had to at least dominate this incomplete world, or else they wouldn't stand a chance against the others. Very soon, the vast bubble would run out of time and they would have to cash in on the bet that the Fox had made. In a final push, they would pit the juniors of the incomplete worlds against one another, taking advantage of the time dilation for one final spurt of accelerated growth. Incomplete worlds were like rolls of the dice. There would be many that evolved down a path far weaker than the dimensional verse, but there would be some that had evolved in special niche ways that placed them on par with even some complete worlds despite lacking the ability to take the final step into the ninth dimension. These latter worlds were what the vast bubble were banking on. They wanted warriors that would be useful, and the dimensional verse was far too weak. And then, once they gave them a path to the ninth dimension, they would have these warriors in the palm of their hands forever. Velasco was supposed to become one of these warriors, but he had grown too powerful on his own. As for whether they would allow the son of such a man to live, well, Wise Star Order laughed into the skies as he landed in the courtyard of his and his wife's abode. That brat was harder to kill than a roach, he'd find a way probably. The only question was how many would die before he did find that path. The answer to that question was more important than anything else. Triple X? You're here? Wise Star Order's mind seemed to filter out his name naturally. At this point he felt that he did it on purpose. Seeing the face of the woman he knew would betray him, and just how gorgeous and equally annoying she was, he felt an amused thought bubble up as a bulge in his pants shifted. The matriarch of the family looked as though she was about to launch into a lecture. She had only married Wise Star Order because he was the most eligible bachelor, but she usually took out the stress of her position on him. Wise Star Order had never been a pushover, but he couldn't defeat this wife of his in the past either, so it was useless. Now though, Wise Star Order took a step forward and grabbed her by the waist, howling her over his shoulder and storming into their bedroom. Triple X. Put me down. The protests were soon drowned out by dense cries for mercy filled with a lustful undertone. Wise Star Order had an excellent time subduing this wife of his. It wouldn't change much about the future, but he didn't care for it to. It would be even more interesting later. His life was just getting started. Chapter 2263, published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 2263, Creation Tablet. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Wise Star Order stood with a stretch, sliding his robes on. I was good to be young. Last time he had gone so hard, his back had ached for days. He ignored the limpid words of his wives. She was hardly intelligible, her speech slurring and her eyes half closed. She was probably saying something about why he wasn't staying in bed, but it was more funny than anything to him. Before this day he had bedded this woman a single time, and she hadn't even let him finish. She only did it out of a sense of duty and to officially consummate their marriage. Of course, the most important reason was because of her ability index. She had been trying to take on his Wise Star Order abilities for herself. As much as he would like to play with this heartless woman some more, he had some work to do. Right, valiant heart. Wise Star Order took a step as his wife's gargled mess of words were becoming sharper and louder. He luckily didn't get to listen to whatever nonsense she was definitely trying to spew. Instead, he had appeared deep within the catacombs of the Luxniks. These catacombs were built by the envoys of the god beast of destruction. There hadn't been an active void beast in countless generations, but that didn't stop the creature's lessers from doing their best to stir up trouble. Despite their usual brazenness, they were somewhat cautious in this world. That was because of the appearance of the Pluto race, and its relation to the existence of these incomplete worlds was something worthy of being wary of. The void bubble was far too weak to even have a single incomplete world for this sort of experiment, let alone dozens. It could only be done by the god races. But at the same time, this world was too valuable precisely because of its variability and potential for evolution. It was the perfect place to experiment with a new force. Since the experiment was a failure, and a youth of the Pluto race had appeared, they chose to abandon it. The place had already been stripped bare by Lionel, but why would they care so much about failures? No, it was probably more accurate to say that they couldn't spare the risk and the failures weren't valuable enough to put themselves on the line. Wise Star Order appeared in the temple once more. Now all that remained was a bronze tablet, and he didn't seem surprised. He had allowed Lionel to take the silver and golden tablets. It would be a long while before Lionel could use the latter, so he wasn't worried. Of course, he didn't expect that foolish disciple of his to understand propriety and not use the tablet even when he could, not in this state anyway. That was Lionel's fault. He would be under a lot of pressure soon, and he might take power from anywhere he could. But if he took it from this source, he would only die sooner. Wise Star Order stepped forward and toward the bronze tablet. He looked as though he was about to crash right through, but the moment his shin looked as though it would crash into the altar, a ripple of space flashed and he disappeared. The Luxnix would probably rush in soon enough but find nothing at all. The Space Y Star Order appeared and was a vast darkness. There was only one thing floating in silence, a single tablet. A single silver tablet. He reached forward and grabbed the creation tablets. NOV, E/L/B, I/NS a Y Star Order. He had a duty to these tablets. Bronze, silver, golden and... He waved the hand with the silver tablet in it and its body rippled, the words on its surface forming into a force art that rolled and foamed with light until it became a blinding crystal color. Star crystal. The crystallization of the purest, attributeless star force. It was the energy that was the very foundation of existence itself. He might be a glorified librarian, but the books he oversaw were far beyond the imagination of most individuals. In an incomplete world, even a silver tablet like this one had infinite power. It could bend and twist reality as it pleased and had very few restrictions. To the god-beasts of creation, though, this was simply a simulator. It was used to document experiments. It was these creation tablets that were the center that allowed the god-beasts of creation to succeed in passing down their bloodlines to humans, and all the while they killed not a single person thanks to it. It's a decent gift, Y Star Order thought to himself. Hell be pretty aimless in his life because of the influence of his future self. Why chase anything when you feel like you have already achieved everything? This should help him get a taste of what it means to have drive and purpose. It'll make the moment his future self vanishes more manageable as hell have his own sense of self. But this isn't quite enough. Y Star Order stroked his chin. Lionel had no idea that his master, a master he didn't even know he had and wouldn't acknowledge until years later, was diligently laying out a plan for his improvement step by step. However, that wouldn't stop Y Star Order from being as diligent as he could. Right, he'll use this to influence a few zones then. He shook the silver tablet again and it went back to normal as he vanished. Streaking across the skies, he felt leisurely, a smile on his face. He guessed that he owed his disciple a small bit of advantage. He had made it so far without any, so Y Star Order wanted to see what he would accomplish now. Y Star Order appeared above Earth, prepared to make some alterations to the timeline. Enough time had passed that the Plutos had long since gone and Earth was slowly building up its own civilizations. Interestingly enough, the true history of Earth seemed to be completely wrong, not that that mattered. Ah, right, I need a name. I can't exactly use Y Star Order, too on the nose. He looked at the tablet. What was it that stupid woman kept calling me? Norem, right? Alright, let's go with Merlin then. Chapter 2264? Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 11 seconds AM. Chapter 2264. Maze, or if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2264. Maze or Lionel appeared back in his timeline. His gains this time were quite great. He had gained the odd beast that fused with little Tali, he had gained a void beast's corpse, and his vital star force had taken a half step into the impetus state. Beyond that, he had been informed about a great many things and even gained the silver and golden tablets. He wasn't too eager to pass down those two tablets to the Luxnix. They had had them for so long back then and accomplished nothing. Giving it to them now wouldn't magically change anything except for his grandmother. Even so, he was hesitant to give it to her either. He had too many questions for that grandfather of his, and his grandmother was practically wrapped around his finger. He was very good at reading people, and he could tell that his grandmother was entirely googly eyes for the Ascension Empire's emperor. She would stand on his side almost no matter what. In a situation like that, he wasn't sure what to think. Did he hate his grandfather? No. Did he distrust him? Not exactly, though it was close enough to that. Did he want to take unnecessary risks? Also no. So he kept it to himself. Instead, rather than returning to the Morales family, he was far more interested in two things. First, Anastasia's second search, and the second, and also the reason they returned home so easily. He wanted to fully understand little Tali, or at least understand him to the greatest extent he could. He stood in a familiar location of the lab setting. It was the first room that had ever formed. His simple workbench ahead, the walls were lined with snow globes and simple shelves. This was the room that he had learned to craft in, the room he had started the first of his father's lessons and gained an understanding toward how he should treat his spirit partner. He sat at the bench and pointed out a hand. Little Tali stretched out, peeling off of his skin and forming a perfect ball. Silver was still the little guy's main color, but the dense runes of white gold that made his head dizzy to look at. Little Tali rolled on the table between Lionel's fingers, making booping sounds that made it seem like it was having a great deal of fun. Interesting. Spirits usually choose a favored form and even a gender after entering the sixth dimension, but little Tali has done neither, choosing to stay like this. Is this because of the way I evolved him? Is it because of the best he assimilated? Or is there another reason? Tolliver should have a perfect fusion of all paths. There was a refinement path, a creation path, a universal force path, and of course the jack of all trades. The first allowed the ease of processing of ores, but not just this alone. This seemed to sound like a spirit would just clear an ore of impurities for you, but it was deeper than that. When one had entered the life grade, you began to appreciate the intricacies of each and every ore. Even when they shared the same name, they weren't exactly equal, and you had to account for all of these little changes when you wanted to create something whole and new, something that had a life of its own. This path was like a cheat code to the life grade. Rather than relying on your personal skill to learn and adapt, you could rely on your spirit instead to force the ores into a predictable path. This lowered the bar to forge life grade crafts considerably. You only had to worry about the blueprint and not the whims of nature. This was the first thing Lionel tested. He took out an ore that went by Maze Oregon. It was a light domain type ore that could project a large amount of illusions as it refracted the light around it. It was an interesting ore he had been playing around with, as he thought it would be interesting to form a troop around this kind of armor. OVL/BI/N. However, it was very difficult to work with despite being a sixth-dimensional Oregon. This was because even the slightest deviation in a cut to the ore could drastically change how it warped light around it, and it could trick the eyes of even its crafter and their spirit, so getting precise cuts in the first place was a nightmare. It was a problem or that most completely ignored. Only those with exceptionally high light force affinity could hope to deal with it, and it was rare enough to have an affinity of such a rare force to begin with, let alone having the skill in crafting to match it. Unless, of course, you had a dream world like Lionel. This or could fool even internal sight, but what it couldn't fool was Lionel's dream world. Even so, there were other problems aside from trying to get perfect cuts, and that was related to the actual and slight differences between the force densities of the ores themselves. Even if he cut them perfectly, these small differences would throw him for a loop. He held out 2 maze ores and handed them to little Tali with a simple command: make them identical in every way. To Lionel's surprise, little Tali only tapped each one of them once, then went back to rolling around and having fun. Lionel's brows shot up before he deployed his dream world. He sat in silence for a long time. He scanned everything about the ore, the cuts, the force balance, the size, the weight. He didn't miss a single detail, even down to its chemical structure. It shouldn't have been anywhere near that fast. Chapter 2265. Published at 26th of October 2023, 11:05 and 9 seconds AM. Chapter 2265. Lighthouse, or if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2265. Lighthouse, or little Tali, was supposed to be a jack of all trades but master of none. However, this speed was even faster than a true master of this purification path should have found possible. He didn't have much of a reference outside of what he had read in the Void Library, but he was certain of this. It wouldn't have been a surprise even if it took days, and the spirit in question should have had to swallow the ores first, process them, and then expel them, not just tap them once. Lionel knew that the beast would cause some great changes in little Tali, and he even expected that the little guy would be more of a master than he knew. But this was greatly exaggerated. Of course, the ores weren't perfect. He only commanded little Tali to make them identical, but he didn't specify how or what parameters he wanted. So, he assumed that the little metal spirit had chosen the easiest path, and not the path best for his army, but he didn't care very much. He took another ore. This one was another sixth-dimensional ore, and it was a vein type or that directly light force. It could be used to dampen and expand the maze force of the maze, or shrouding a much larger area than that of the troop with the maze armors, or it could be used to do the opposite and shrink the illusions to contend against a small number of enemies or even one powerful enemy. This vein type or was known as Lighthouse, or it was the best or in this category at controlling light force. The reason for its necessity was quite obvious. Maze, or once its cuts were set, could be confusing to look at, but not much about it would change over time, and it lacked flexibility. This would fix all of that. However, Lionel felt it would be better if they were the same or containing the characteristics of control and confusion. Of course, that was easier said than done. Lionel had never bothered because considering all the effort it would take, he might as well just forge the both of them into a life-grade armor. It would be the same thing, mostly. Unless the second path of the spirits allowed one to fuse ores into one, creating all new effects and combining abilities. This was yet another cheat code of the life grade, making the ores perfect for crafting into a holistic and whole form. I haven't studied these two enough, I need a third maze or dash, Lionel mumbled to himself, prepared to take out a third, but then he froze. Little Tali's white gold runes lit up and a maze or suddenly spit out from thin air. There was only the slightest fluctuation of force in the surroundings, as though the little one was pulling on something, and then it appeared, just like that, in a flash of light. Lionel reached forward, slowly picking the ore up. It was a maze or perfect and whole. He squeezed it and it was crushed between his palms. Everything about it was exactly the same, even the resistance. It wasn't an illusion at all, or else he would have sensed the dream force by now. He looked toward little Tali. I need another. Little Tali didn't think much, making a cute bloop sound and forming another. Lionel picked it up and he was completely shaken. This one was slightly different from the last one, and the last one was slightly different from the two that he had originally given little Tali. I need a lighthouse, Oregon. Little Tali sat in silence for a while, confused. Then, suddenly being enlightened, it reached forward and touched the lighthouse ore in Lionel's hand quickly, then pulled back, acting innocent before it flashed with light. A perfectly whole lighthouse ore appeared, slightly different from the one in Lionel's hands. Little Tali didn't even seem to be struggling at all. OVL/BI/ and Lionel immediately put the little metal spirit through a countless series of tests, pushing the little one to the limits, or so he tried. Nothing he did seemed to tire little Tali out at all. He assumed that it was because he didn't go far enough, but this alone was shocking. Little Tali could perfectly replicate or at the 6th dimension and below without much effort at all. It was completely stone-walled when it came to higher ores, and it more so seemed like a yes or no switch rather than an effort switch. Each time he created one, he pulled from the force in the surroundings, causing each one to be just a little bit different, just like real ores you would find in a mine. What was more shocking than that was that after creating the new ore, a fusion of maze ore and lighthouse ore, little Tali became like a database, remembering the new ore and being able to create it even without the two base ores any longer. There wasn't even a point in testing the third path, that of using universal force to supplement crafting, because Lionel could already feel it passively when Tolliver stuck to his arm. But he chose to do so anyway just to cover all of his bases, and this was maybe the most shocking of them all. When he used universal force through Tolliver, he could sense something beyond, or maybe it was on par. He wasn't entirely sure. It was like he could touch upon the veil of the world and he discovered something absolutely shocking. He could sense the constellations of the dimensional verse. Those of the human domain, those beyond the human domain, it didn't seem to matter in the slightest. Not only could he sense them, but he could use little Tali as a bridge connecting to them, and using these constellations to directly power his creations. The implications of such a thing were beyond what Lionel could even fathom currently, especially once he stepped outside of this verse. As he was thinking, Anastasia's voice drifted to his ear. I'm sorry, Lionel, there is no such innate node in this time either. Erdél's note, off course LOL. Chapter 2266. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 8 seconds AM. Chapter 2266. A suit. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2266. A suit. Lionel fell into silence for a moment before he closed his eyes and exhaled a slow breath. When he opened them again, there was a resolute look within. The plan remained the same. Crush this dimensional verse into his fists as quickly as possible, open a path to the outside world, and if he was lucky enough to enter the impetus state before then he would forget about this matter. If he wasn't, then he didn't believe in the whole of wider existence. There wasn't at least one such person. He didn't care how powerful they were, what their background was. If it would save Aina, he would do it. With me, Tolliver. Well, finish this within a day with your help. The sound of popping bubbles and bubbling water echoed. It sounded much more complex than the noises little Tali usually made, and Lionel even felt that he could even somewhat understand the little metal spirit far better. While it hadn't seemed to mature exactly as he had expected, it had definitely still matured. Confidence and excitement radiated from Tolliver, and Lionel even felt like the metal spirit was a miniature version of himself, at least somewhat. Good. Lionel got to work. A day later, he stepped out from the lab setting, sharp-eyed and radiating a suppressive aura. The first thing he did was go and speak to his mother. After confirming that she had already formed the Golden Tiger lineage factor, he asked her to follow him. It was about time they returned to the Morales family and saw what the situation was. Not much time had passed. The time allocated for the mission within the zone should have taken years to finish, and the time dilation was, as a result, quite forgiving. Due to this, Lionel and his mother had only been inside for a few minutes. Overall, it was only a single day if his time spent crafting was. On that day, not only had he completed the final sets of armor for his demon troops, but he had also reformed his divine armors again. If you want to return to the Morales family, you can't wear that, Eleanor suddenly said as Anastasia set off. Oh? Lionel looked down at himself. His robes were decent enough, though not as elaborate as the ones he had worn to match Aina as they entered the air wars. But they were still decent enough. He had wanted to wear his sweatpants, but he felt that he should be a bit more mindful of his image. That said, he wasn't exactly in tune with the fashion sense of the wider dimensional verse, he just randomly picked something out. Now that he thought about it, it was Aina who had decided on their matching robes as well. He was much better at designing cool uniforms, but now wasn't the time for that. V-E-L-B-I. And Eleanor shook her head and patted Lionel's cheeks. I didn't want to overstep my bounds before, but I won't let anyone stop me from being a mom now, not even you. She waved a hand and a white robe appeared. Lionel's expression became a bit weird. Why white? It wasn't that he hated the color, but he would prefer something bolder. What about black and gold? A nice gray and blue also sounded nice. Don't doubt your mother, little lion. Now come, strip. Lionel's face became weirder. What are you doing? Hurry up now, I haven't got all day. Lionel coughed and stripped off his outer robes. He wasn't a shy person and had gotten into his fair share of wild battles that had practically left him entirely naked. But for some reason he felt a little uncomfortable standing in front of his mother in his boxers. Eleanor looked at his body and nodded, patting her own shoulder as though she had done a great job. Lionel's physique had already been exceptional ever since he entered the fourth dimension. He had gone from an elite athlete to a man that seemed more like a fitness model than anything else. But now, whether it was in vascularity, leanness, or definition, he was levels above. She threw a pair of white pants and robes at Lionel. When Lionel caught them, he felt that the material was incomparably soft, almost like silk and clouds had a baby. On top of that, looking a bit closer at more than just the color, there were faint patterns of a gray so subtle that it almost looked white as well. But together, the subtle embroidery made it look quite noble and elegant. When he put them on, he was actually quite satisfied. The material even made his force flow with a smoother cadence. He made a mental note to study up on fabrics and how he could incorporate them into his crafts. His father's teachings had had sewing lessons, but he hadn't applied them anywhere but the beast skin armors he had made for his companions during the Void Palace True Selection. However, his mom didn't seem to be finished. She had yet to help him accessorize. By the time Lionel was done, he was wearing a golden chain around his neck and wrist, the latter of which was just barely hidden beneath his love sleeve, and the former of which was just as subtle beneath his collar. His hair was slicked back in a formless gel that he couldn't even feel, and he actually wore shoes for a change. His white suit with faint gray embroidery reminded him of an Indian-style suit, a Jodhpuri if his memory hadn't failed him. As for his mother's nods of satisfaction, they were even more exaggerated. Now your father's glasses, Eleanor commanded. Lionel froze, but his mother's tone didn't seem to leave room for negotiation. With a deep breath, he slipped them on and Eleanor beamed. There's my little lion. Go on now. Lionel shifted the crystal-framed glasses on his face and then stepped out, a vibrant violet color in his eyes. When he stepped out, he found the Morales family in chaos. Chapter 2267, published at 26th of October 2023 11:05 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 2267. Gifts. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2267 Gifts. The Morales family wasn't under attack, at least not officially. Rather, the ships of several powers were in the surroundings, each one had come with gifts, these gifts being Lionel's demands of them in exchange for the lives of their juniors. Due to the matters that had happened the moment the air wars ended, they hadn't had time to gather up these materials. But Lionel's ability to read the intentions of people and further these powers only got sharper the stronger his mind became. He could see the difference between those that had come with the intention of actually paying up, and those that expected the gesture alone to be enough. The Morales family elders had simply said that Lionel wasn't here, but how could these people believe that? So they had started pressing, leaving their warships up in the air around the Morales capital. Of course, if it was aggressive enough for a war declaration, the Morales would have never come this far, but the intention was obvious enough. However, as bold as the threat was, Lionel's lip curled. He could sense the hesitation, the fear, and why shouldn't they have such reservations? The momentum of the Morales was unlike anything they had ever seen. If not for his father's death, maybe they wouldn't even dare to do this much. This was a test. They wanted to see how much they could push the Morales. As Lionel walked toward the capital, his mother a half step behind him with a doting and caring expression on her face, his presence seemed to loom, becoming taller and taller until the world fell into its own sort of silence. The engines of the warships still blared, the raging winds caused by their presences, and the distortions in gravity were still heavy. However, in the end it still felt as though there was only one person that could be focused on. The members of the Morales who were just passively observing this situation from the outside, not quite knowing of the internal conflict between Lionel and their own elders, felt a sense of pride well up in their hearts. This was the champion of the air wars. Not just any air war, but an unprecedented air war that would be remembered for generations. A man that stood atop the strongest collection the human domain had seen since its inception. And he was a Morales. He was their patriarch. The will of the Morales seemed to solidify, and the flickers of their constellation in the sky dimmed the momentum of the surrounding families considerably. The faces of their messengers fell. Never did they expect that the appearance of just one person would have such a profound effect on the situation, but they steeled their hearts. They had already expected much of this, though not all of it. It was the reason for their partial caution in the first place. But even so, they still represented the whole of the human domain, and even the Suyard family and the spirituals' religion had suffered at the hands of Lionel, not to mention the Omen family. 3 organizations and families, all on the same level as the Morales, had come for compensation. No matter what the future of the Morales looked like, it was still the future and not the present. It was impossible for them to have taken full benefit from their constellation and new lineage factor already. This was their best chance to suppress them. The so-called messengers were all among the strongest these families could call forward without sending their ancestors. If they sent their ancestors, it would have a much different connotation, and they didn't want to take that step just yet. Instead, they sent the very strongest of their 7th-dimensional elites. The constellation families, the Constellation Bow Alliance, the Suyard, the Omen, the spirituals' religion. But they were just the beginning. Once again, the smaller families became a pawn in the game of the big wigs, countless smaller 7th-dimensional families, and even a minority of 6th-dimensional families appearing as well. They all had the intention of stepping off their ships and questioning Lionel directly, but the latter waved a hand. Novi LB/1 All of a sudden, the strength of the world trembled and their ships were locked in place, all of the force arts no longer responding to their call as though they were cut off from the laws of the world. Guests should wait to be invited in. You wouldn't want to be rude, right? Lionel asked lightly. The messengers froze as Lionel strolled into the planet-swallowing palace of the Morales. Within, the elders were in heated discussion. They hadn't even gotten time to implement many of Lionel's changes before this happened. They all realized they hadn't improved nearly enough yet. While their pride wanted to fight it out with the rest of the human domain immediately, the cost of this was heavy, especially since they had already sent much of the evacuees back to their homes due to Lionel's orders. If not for Lionel's almost blinding presence, they wouldn't have even noticed someone enter, something that was a hint embarrassing. Some found themselves subconsciously exhaling when Lionel appeared before catching themselves. Since when had they trusted this brat so much? He hadn't proven anything but how rude he was. Lionel scanned the region, but the Overlord was nowhere to be seen. Ancestor Isa and Ancestor Alvaro seemed to have taken over the proceedings, but because the other families hadn't sent any ancestors, it would be a sign of weakness if they took direct action, so they were trying to find some workarounds. Seeing Lionel, the two had their own complicated set of reactions, but in the end they exhaled. Patriarch. They greeted at the same time. Of course they weren't unduly respectful. The word patriarch coming from them sounded no different than had they said Lionel's name directly. They noticed Eleanor as well, but they chose not to say anything. For one, they were quite familiar with Lionel's temper by now, and he might do something ridiculous if they really said something, and secondly, well, she carried the Morales name too. Is there really all that much to talk about? Let them come and bring us great gifts. The expressions of the ancestors and elders changed. Chapter 2268. Published at 26th of October 2023 11:04 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 2268. Junior Ancestors. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. O-V/L/B/1. And Chapter 2268. Junior Ancestors. The elders were truly stunned by Lionel's words. Their first assumption was that Lionel didn't understand what he was talking about, lacking in too much experience to see what the problem was. Take, for example, two individuals of vastly different standings, one of which was a man of average class and fit well amongst the common people, and the second of which was a noble existence, an emperor or king even. Would the man of average class be able to make a deal of equal with the king? According to the rules of society, they would be, by their very nature, two existences of vastly different worths. Making a deal of equals first necessitated being equals in the first place. A king could order a man of average class to do as he pleased, the vice versa would ever be true. How this applied to the current situation was obvious. The Morales might be a king if it was dealing with any one family, but the problem was that it wasn't dealing with one family or even one organization, it was dealing with the entire human domain. How could they match up? What did it mean to make a deal of equals? It meant that if one party should default on their word, the consequences the opposing party could force them to pay would be too great for them to ignore. This would force both parties into upholding their word. What could a man of average class do to a king? And in this situation, in an exchange of life for treasure, if these families defaulted on their words, they would lose one genius, true enough. But they would also be able to gain a reason to retaliate in kind. But what about the Morales? If Lionel didn't follow through, then he would bring down the wrath of the entire human domain on the Morales. This was fundamentally not a deal of equals. So when Lionel spoke of just accepting the gifts, it sounded like a joke, like a peasant trying to force the hand of a king to give him treasures for doing something easily within his power. However, Lionel didn't seem to notice their reactions at all. He walked forward, taking his seat at the helm, his mother standing to his back, though only for a moment. At an unknown time, a flash of green surrounded Eleanor and she vanished into thin air as though she had never been there. It was impossible to tell if she was still behind Lionel, or if she had gone off to some other place. Lionel smiled. Ancestor Isa, Ancestor Alvaro, he'll have to ask you two to leave. Our guests have only brought forward seventh-dimensional experts, it would be beneath your station to appear here, no? Leave this matter for a junior like me. The eyes of the two ancestors flickered. Lionel's words just now was probably the nicest thing he had ever said to them. Well, it was at the very least not as rude as the usual. But it was clear what his intentions were. If they really left, then what happened from here on would be dictated entirely by Lionel's temper, and they didn't know if they could trust such a thing. However, what they didn't expect was that they wouldn't get a chance. Lionel tapped a finger subtly after he spoke, and the world's power descended. In the eyes of others, it looked as though the two had disappeared under their own power. The other ancestors looked toward one another and one by one, they too vanished. Lionel radiated a confidence that left the remaining elders a bit stunned. In the end, they too took deep breaths and found their positions, taking a seat. Elder Chris, a middle-aged woman with a stern face and short-cut hair, stood immediately. Yes, Patriarch. Lionel tapped his armrest for a moment in thought. Do we have any promising youths in this coming generation? Elder Chris was one of the head commanders of the Divine Guards and also one of the strongest among the peak seventh-dimensional Morales. For those like this, the Morales had their own unique names for them, and they called this group of elders the Junior Ancestors, though there was nothing junior about them at all. She would be among the best in knowing what promising youths there were, at least in combat. The Morales had yet to get used to the fact that the Spear Domain lineage factor and the Metal Synergy lineage factor had now become one. Among the post-Nova generation, there are indeed a few good seedlings, she nodded in affirmation. Pick one, call them here, Lionel said. Her gaze flickered, but Lionel had already moved on. Elder Arya. Yet another older woman stood, straight and tall. She didn't look nearly as stern, but there was still a hint of authority between her brows. Her hair was long and tinged with deep hints of silver that alternated with the usual deep brown of the Morales, and from her neck hung a pair of glasses. She was one of the head crafters and led the crafters of the family in many things. She wasn't a junior ancestor in raw strength, but rather in the power of her divine armor and how cleverly she implemented her crafts. In this way she was a lot like the Radix family but on a completely different level. Unlike Elder Chris, though, she didn't call out to him as patriarch, not that there was a rule for this. Do the same as Elder Chris, call one here. She frowned. Patriarch, she said slowly, this matter is quite delicate, it isn't very appropriate for. Lionel looked over and met her eyes. Elder Arya could see an almost indifferent sort of gentleness within, but it still froze her. The weight of the world bore down. Inappropriate? I think it will be fine, Lionel said with a smile. We just need a few flower girls and ring boys. The hearts of the elders skipped a beat, but everything was quickly put into motion. Soon, the doors of the Morales Palace were opened wide, and at the forefront, two teenagers, one young man and one young woman, stood forward, their pride beaming and the arrogance of the Morales blooming out from deep within them. The Morales family welcomes you, they roared. Chapter 2269, published at 26th of October 2023 11:04 and 50 seconds AM. Chapter 2269. Guest: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 2269. Guest: Tommy Morales. A bright spark of the Spear faction and a young man of 15 years old with a pair of eyebrows that looked like a flare of fire. His face was just as stern as his instructor's, but the hints of immaturity on his face were clear, but it carried a vibrancy of youth. Nora Morales. A bright light of the crafting faction, she too was 15 years old, and she had an interesting style herself. Her metal spirit held her hair up into two ponytails. It couldn't help but remind Lionel of a certain faction leader from Valiant Heart Mountain. She too used her fire spirit to hold her hair up. It exhibited quite a level of control. But Lionel only smiled when he saw this. Though it was well hidden, he could see a special fabric and clips separate Nora's hair from her metal spirit. It was clear that Lionel was still one of the very few, if not the only one, in the human domain that dared to touch his metal spirit directly. Even so, it still took quite a bit of control to stop her metal spirit from eating through the metal and getting at her hair, which was worthy of a great deal of praise. Together they were two of the brightest stars of the next generation. Considering their age, it wouldn't even be much more than 5 years before they were meant to participate in the air wars, but the timeline wasn't on their side this time around. The two held up their spears and slammed their butts into the ground, a soaring spear force coming from them. It was quite weak. You couldn't expect much from fifth-dimensional existences like them, and yet, the constellation in the skies appeared once again. Their strength soared from the fifth dimension to the sixth and from the sixth the seventh, but by the time their spear force reached the height of the surrounding battleships, they sang like a pair of dragons and phoenixes. Shaken, the various family messengers entered the hall one by one. Their edge had been filed down to a dull tip and the hesitation in their steps was clear. The only ones that seemed to carry the same sort of confidence were those of the strongest families, with the standouts being that of the Suyard family, the Spirituals religion, the Omen family, and a special, unexpected visitor. The Void Palace. Lionel didn't react much to this. The loss of the Void Elders, or at least most of the Void Elders, wouldn't be enough to crumble them entirely. An organization like this would have its trump cards, but even more importantly than that, the Void Palace was the symbol of humanity. Even if it fell, it would be held up by the various families of the human domain. N-O-V-L-B. And of course, whether or not the mission of the palace would stay the same after this, that was a different story entirely. If they were anything more than a puppet, it would be an amusing surprise. The leader of the Void Palace, obviously here to play the role of mediator, was actually quite a young man. Lionel recognized him almost immediately, and he found it even more amusing. This young man was a member of the Unfettered Blade Party, Mykarth. The last time Lionel met him, he was a galaxy-ranked disciple just a couple weeks away from the sector rank. Now he was nearly a domain-ranked disciple. For the Void Palace to not even send a domain-ranked disciple to mediate the situation was funny enough, but even more importantly than all these other identities. His last name was Suyard. Mykarth had a deep hatred for Lionel. He first found trouble for the latter after his father severed Rosen Suyard's arm, Mykarth's uncle. And it only became personal after Lionel personally defeated him in battle. Honestly, Lionel had to say that Mykarth was the perfect choice. He was the absolute most talented among the Suyard family. That was a title that went to Amory. He wasn't a step below that, as there were 3 others who would have been part of the Suyard family's heir wars that were passed up for Amory. He was just a step below that. He was a great talent for sure. But he wasn't prominent enough to be said to be a representation of the Suyard family, and he was just talented enough to have a great position in the Unfettered Blade Party and the Void Palace. It would be geniuses like him who likely held up the foundation of the Void Palace now, and in the future the Void Palace of the past would be no more, controlled like a puppet behind the scenes by these powerful families. In fact, that future might be here already, or else the likes of Mykarth would have never been sent first. Mykarth cleared his throat, a slightly prideful expression on his face with the comfort of his family's backing to support him, but before he could speak, Patriarch Morales has yet to ask you to speak. Please be mindful of your position and only speak when spoken to. Tommy spoke with a crisp voice. While it was slightly immature, it carried the same hints of sternness head commander Chris had. Much like his mentor, he was a stickler for rules and etiquette. He would never allow a guest to speak before his patriarch, nor would he allow his patriarch to have to be the one to correct this guest. He and Nora stood to Lionel's back, one to each side, arms clasped behind their backs. As a pair of youths, they did surprisingly well in this atmosphere, and it was clear that much of their confidence came from the man on the throne before them. The older generation might be hesitant about Lionel, but the feelings of the youth were quite clear when it came to him. He was their idol. Mykarth's face flushed red. Never did he expect to be reprimanded by a child like this, but he also wasn't in a position to argue with one either, especially when said child was in the right. Lionel smiled lightly and slowly opened his mouth. Some thought he might say some fake words to reprimand Tommy, but he did no such thing. Welcome, dear guests. I assume that you've come with the offerings? You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.